them, and they, seeing themselves now delivered from their assailants, and their main anxiety being to remove themselves and their charge from so hostile a neighborhood, whilst they might still enjoy protection of this demigod, made haste to obey him, his Grace of Buckingham. For already the people had recognized him, and his name had been uttered with awe in their ranks, stepped ahead, and waved back those who stood before him. "Away!" he bade them, with the air of a prince speaking to his grooms. "Give room." He disdained even to use the menace of his sword, which he now carried tucked under his left arm. His voice and mien sufficed, and a lane was opened in that living press to which he advanced with calm assurance, the chairmen hurrying with their burden in his wake. The lackeys closed in behind the chair and followed to form a rear guard. But there was scarcely the need, for all attempt to hinder or molest the chair was at an end. Indeed, none troubled to accompany it farther. The people broke up into groups again, or moved away about their business, realizing that here the entertainment was at an end. The fanatic who had led the attack and the knaves who had joined him had vanished suddenly, mysteriously, and completely. Of the very few spectators whom curiosity or interest still attracted was Hollis, and this perhaps chiefly because Miss Farquharson was being carried in the direction in which his own business was taking him. He came down the steps of the inn and followed leisurely at some little distance. They swung steadily along as far as Paternoster Row, where the traffic was slight. Here the Duke halted at last and turned, and at a sign from him the men set down the chair. His Grace advanced to the window, swept off his broad-plumed hat, and bowed until the golden curls of his periwig almost met across his face. Within the chair, still very pale, but quite composed again by now, sat Miss Farquharson, regarding his Grace with a very odd expression, an expression best described as speculative. "Child!" he exclaimed, a hand upon his heart, a startled look on his handsome face. "I vow that you have taught me the meaning of fear, for I was never frightened in my life until today. What imprudence, my dear Sylvia, to show yourself here in the city, when men's minds are so distempered by war and pestilence that they must be seeking scapegoats wherever they can find them. None may call me devout, yet devout I feel at this moment. For my soul I return thanks to heaven that by a miracle I chance to be here to save you from this peril." She leaned forward, and her hooded cloak of light silk, having fallen back from head and shoulders, revealed the white luster of her beauty. She was smiling slightly, a smile that curled her delicate lip and lent something hard and disdainful to eyes that naturally were soft and gentle, long-shaped, rather wistful eyes of a deep color that was something between blue and green. "It was a most fortunate chance, Your Grace," she said, almost tonelessly. "Fortunate, indeed," he fervently agreed with her, and, hat in hand, dabbed his brow with a fine handkerchief. Your Grace was very opportunely at hand. And now there was a world of mocking meaning in her tone. She understood at last, she thought, upon whose behalf that fanatic had spied upon her going forth, afterward to follow and assail her, thus providing occasion for this very romantic rescue. Having thus shrewdly appraised the situation, the actress in her awoke to play her part in it, and so she had mocked him with that phrase, "Your Grace was very opportunely at hand." "I thank God for it, and so may you, child," was a quick answer, ignoring the mockery, which had not escaped him. But Miss Farquharson was none so disposed, it seemed, to the devout thanksgiving he advised. "Is your Grace often east of Temple Bar?" was her next rallying question. "Are you?" quoth he, possibly for lack of better answer. "So seldom that the coincidence transcends all that yourself or Mr. Dryden could have invented for one of your plays. Life is marvelously coincident," the Duke reflected, conceiving obtuseness to be the proper wear for the innocence he pretended. "Coincidence is the salt that rescues existence from insipidity. So, and it was to rescue this that you rescued me, and so that you might have opportunity for rescuing me. No doubt yourself you contrived the danger." "I contrived the danger?" He was aghast. He did not at first understand. "I contrived the danger. Child." It was a cry of mingled pain and indignation, and the indignation at least was not pretended. The contempt of her tone had cut him like a whip. It made him see that he was ridiculous in her eyes, and his Grace of Buckingham liked to be ridiculous as little as another, perhaps less than most. "How can you think it of me?" "Think it of you?" She was laughing. "Lord, I knew it. Sir, the moment I saw you take the stage at the proper cue, at what you would call the dramatic moment. Enter hero, very gallant. Oh, sir, I am none so easily cozened. I was a fool to allow myself to be deceived into fear by those other silly mummers, the first murderer and his myrmidons. It was poorly contrived. Yet it carried the groundlings in Paul's yard quite off their feet, and they'll talk of your brave carriage and mighty mien for a whole day, at least. But you could scarce expect that it should move me as well, since I am in the play, as it were. It was said of him, and with truth, that he was the most impudent fellow in England, this lovely, accomplished, foolish son of man whose face had made his fortune. Yet her raillery now put him out of countenance. It was only with difficulty that he could master the fury it awoke in him. Yet master it he did, lest he should cut a still sorrier figure. I vow you're monstrously unjust. He contrived at last to stammer. You ever have thought the worst of me? It all comes of that cursed supper party and the behavior of those drunken fools. Yet I have sworn to you that it was through no fault of mine, that my only satisfaction lay in your prompt departure from a scene with which I would not for all the world have offended you. Yet, though I have sworn it, I doubt if you believe me. Does your grace wonder? She asked him coolly. He looked at her a moment with brooding, wicked eyes. Then he loosed some little of his anger, but loosed it on a pretense. I would to heaven I had left you to those knaves that persecuted you. She laughed outright. I wonder what turn the comedy would have taken then, had you failed to answer to your cue. Perhaps my persecutors would have been put to the necessity of rescuing me, themselves, lest they should incur your anger. That would have been diverting. Oh, but enough. She put aside her laughter. I thank your grace for the entertainment provided. And since it has proved unprofitable, I trust your grace will not go to the pains of providing yet another of the same kind. Oh, sir, if you can take shame for anything, take shame for the dullness of your invention. She turned from him with almost contemptuous abruptness to command the chairman standing at her side. Take up, Nathaniel. Let us on, and quickly, or I shall be late. She was obeyed, and thus departed without so much as another glance of the gay Duke of Bucks, who, too crestfallen to attempt to detain her, or to renew his protestations, stood hat in hand, white with anger, gnawing his lip, conscious, above all, that she had plucked from him a mask that left him an object of derision, and showed his face to appear the face of a fool. In the background his lackeys sought with pains to preserve a proper stolidity of countenance, whilst a few passers-by paused to stare at that splendid bare-headed figure of a courtliness rarely seen on foot in the streets of the city. Conscious of their regard, investing it with a greater penetration than it could possibly possess, his grace conceived them all to be the mocking witnesses of his discomfiture. He ground his heel in a sudden spasm of rage, clapped on his hat, and turned to depart to regain his waiting coach. But suddenly his right arm was seized in a firm grip, and a voice, in which quivered wonder and something besides, assailed his ears. Sir, sir. He swung round and glared into shaven, aquiline face and wonder-laden eyes of Colonel Hollis, who had come up behind the chair whilst the Duke was in conversation with its occupant, and had gradually crept nearer, as if drawn by some irresistible attraction. Amazed, the Duke looked him over from head to toe, conceiving in this shabby stranger another witness of his humiliation. His anger, seeking a vent, flamed out. "What's this?" he rasped. "Do you presume to touch me, sirrah?" The colonel, never flinching as another might have done under a tone that was harsh and arrogant as a blow, before eyes that blazed upon him out of that white face, made answer simply. "I touched you once before, I think, and you suffered it with a better grace. For then it was to serve you that I touched you. Ha! And it will be to remind me of it that you touch me now," came our fine gentleman's quick, contemptuous answer. Stricken by the brutality of the words, Hollis crimsoned slowly under his tan, what time his steady glance returned the Duke's contempt with interest. Then, without answering, he swung on his heel to depart. But there was in this something so odd and so deliberately offensive to one accustomed to be treated ever with the deepest courtesy, that it was now the Duke who caught him by the arm in a grip of sudden anger, arresting his departure. "Sir, a moment." They were face to face again, and now the arrogance was entirely on the side of Hollis. The Duke's countenance reflected astonishment and some resentment. "I think," he said at last, "that you are something wanting in respect. There, At least your discernment is not at fault, the colonel answered him. Deeper grew the Duke's wonder. Do you know who I am? He asked after another pause. I learned it 5 minutes since. But I thought you said that you did me a service once. That was many years ago. And I did not know then your name. Your Grace is probably forgotten. Because of the disdainful tone he took, he commanded the respect and attention of one who was a very master of disdain. Also the Duke's curiosity was deeply stirred. Will you not assist my memory? He invited, almost gently. The colonel laughed a little grimly. Then, shaking the Duke's still detaining grip, without ceremony from his arm, he raised his hand, and holding back the light brown curls, revealed his left ear and the long ruby that adorned it. Buckingham stared an instant, then leaned nearer to obtain a closer view, and he caught his breath in sudden surprise. How came you by that jewel? He asked, his eyes scanning the soldier's face as he spoke. And out of his abiding sense of injury, the colonel answered him. It was given me after Worcester as a keepsake by an empty fribble whose life I thought worth saving. Oddly enough, there was no answering resentment from his Grace. Perhaps his wonder overwhelmed and stilled at the moment every other emotion. So, it was you. His eyes continued to search that lean countenance. Aye, he added after a moment, and it sounded like a sigh. The man had just such a nose and was of your inches. But in no other respect do you look like the Cromwellian who befriended me that night. You had no ringlets then. Your hair was cropped to a godly length, but you're the man. How odd to meet you again thus. How passing odd. His Grace seemed suddenly bemused. They cannot err, he muttered, continuing to regard the colonel from under knitted brows, and his eyes were almost the eyes of a visionary. I have been expecting you, he said, and again he used that cryptic phrase. They cannot err. It was Hollis's turn to be surprised, and out of his surprise he spoke. Your Grace has been expecting me? These many years. It was foretold me that we should meet again. Aye, and that for a time our lives should run intertwined in their courses. Foretold? Ejaculated Hollis. Instantly he bethought him of the superstitions which had made him cling to that jewel through every stress of fortune. How foretold? By whom? He asked. The question seemed to arouse the Duke from the brooding into which he had fallen. Sir, he said, we cannot stand talking here, and we have not met thus, after all these years, to part again without more. His manner resumed its normal arrogance. If you have business, sir, it must wait upon my pleasure. Come. He took the colonel by the arm, whilst over his shoulder he addressed his waiting lackeys in French, commanding two of them to follow. Hollis, unresisting, curious, bewildered, a man walking in a dream, suffered himself to be led whither the other pleased, as a man lets himself drift upon the bosom of the stream of destiny. Chapter 13, Buckingham's Gratitude. In a room above stairs which his Grace had commanded in an inn at the corner of Paternoster Row, they sat alone, the Duke of Buckingham and the man to whom he owed his life. There was no doubt of the extent of the debt, as both well knew, for on that night, long years ago, when his Grace lay faint and wounded on that stricken field of battle, he had fallen a prey to a pair of those human jackals who scour the battleground to strip the living and the dead. The young Duke had sought gallantly enough, considering his condition, to defend himself from their depredations, whereupon, whilst one of them held him down, the other had bared a knife to make an end of his rash resistance. And then out of the surrounding gloom had sprung young Hollis, brought to that spot by merest chance. His heavy cut-and-thrust blade had opened the skull of the villain who wielded the knife, whereupon his fellow had incontinently fled. Thereafter, half supporting, half carrying the lovely wounded boy whom he had rescued, the young Cromwellian officer had assisted him to the safety and shelter of a royalist yeoman's cottage. All this they both remembered, and upon this they dwell a moment now. A table stood between them, and on that table a quart of Burgundy which the Duke had called for that he might entertain his guest. In my heart, said Hollis, I always believed that we should meet again one day, which is why I clung to this jewel. Had I known your name, I should have sought you out. As it was, I harbored the conviction that chance would bring me across your path. Not chance. Destiny, said his Grace, with quiet conviction. Why, destiny, if you prefer to call it so. This jewel now, it is very odd. I have clung to it through all these years, as I have said. I have clung to it through some odd shifts which the sale of it might have relieved. Clung to it against the day when we should meet again, that it might serve as my credential. He did not add that to him the oddest thing of all was that today, at the very moment of this meeting, he was on his way to sell the jewel, compelled to it at last by direst need. The Duke was nodding, his face thoughtful. Destiny, you see. It was preordained. The meeting was foretold. Did I not say so? And again Hollis asked him, as he had asked before, foretold by whom? This time the Duke answered him. By whom? By the stars. They are the only true prophets, and their messages are plain to him who can read them. I suppose you never sought that lore. Hollis stared at him a moment. Then he shook his head and smiled in a manner to imply his contempt of charlatanry. I am a soldier, sir, he said. Why, so am I when the occasion serves. But that does not prevent me from being a reader of the heavens, a writer of verse, a lawgiver in the north, a courtier here, and several other things besides. Man in his time plays many parts. Who plays one only may as well play none. To live, my friend, you must sip at many wells of life. He developed that thesis, discoursing easily, wittily, and with the indefinable charm he could command, a charm which was fastening upon our adventurer, now even as it had fastened upon him years ago in that hour of their brief but fateful meeting. When just now you chanced upon me, he concluded, I was playing hero and lover, author and mummer all in one, and playing them all so unsuccessfully that I never found myself in a more vexatious part. On my soul, if there lay no debt between us already, you must have rendered me your debtor now that you can rescue my mind for an hour or so from the tormenting thought of that sweet baggage who keeps me on the rack. You saw, perhaps, how the little wanton used me. He laughed, and yet through his laughter ran a note of bitterness. But I contrived the mummery clumsily, as she reproached me, and no doubt I deserved to be laughed off the stage, which is what happened. But she shall pay me, and with interest, one of these fine days, for all the trouble she's given me. She shall? Oh, but a plague on the creature. It is of yourself, sir, that I would hear. What are you now, that were once a Commonwealth man? Nobody's man at present. I have seen a deal of service since those days, both at home and abroad, yet it has brought me small gear, as you can see for yourself. Faith, yes. Buckingham regarded him more critically. I should not judge your condition to be prosperous. You may judge it to be desperate, and never fear to exaggerate. So, the Duke raised his eyebrows. Is it so bad? I vow I am grieved. His face settled into lines of courteous regret. But it is possible I may be of service to you. There is a debt between us. I should welcome the opportunity to discharge it. What is your name, sir? You have not told me. Hollis. Randall Hollis, lately a colonel of horse in the stadtholder's service. The Duke frowned reflectively. The name had touched a chord of memory and set it faintly vibrating in his brain. A while the note eluded him. Then he had it. Randall Hollis? He echoed slowly, questioningly. That was the name of a regicide who... But you cannot be he. You are too young by 30 years. He was my father, said the colonel. Oh! The Duke considered him blankly. I do not wonder that you lack employment here in England. My friend, with the best intentions to repay you the great service that you did me, this makes it very difficult. The new-risen hope perished again in the colonel's face. It is as I feared. He was beginning gloomily, when the Duke leaned forward and set a hand upon his arm. I said difficult, my friend. I did not say impossible. I admit the impossibility of nothing that I desire, and I swear that I desire nothing at present more ardently than your better fortune. Meanwhile, Colonel Hollis, that I may serve you, I must know more of you. You have not told me yet how Colonel Hollis, sometime in the army of the Commonwealth, and more lately in the service of the stadtholder, happens to be endangering his neck in the London of Old Rowley, this king whose memory for injuries is as endless as a lawsuit. Colonel Hollis told him, saving the matter of how he had been tempted to join the ill-starred Danver conspiracy under persuasion of Tucker and Rathbone. He used the utmost candor, frankly avowing the mistakes he had made by following impulses that were never right. He spoke of the ill luck that had dogged him, to snatch away each prize in a moment that he put forth his hand to seize it, down to the command in Bombay which Albemarle had already practically conferred upon him. The debonair Duke was airily sympathetic. He condoled and jested in a breath, his jests being in themselves a promise that all this should now be mended. But when Hollis came to matter of the Bombay command, his Grace's laughter sounded a melancholy note. "And it was I who robbed you of this," he cried. "Why? See how mysteriously destiny has been at work. But this multiplies my debt. It adds something for which I must make amends. Rest assured that I shall do so. I shall find a way to set you on the road to fortune. But we must move cautiously, as you realize. Depend upon me to move surely, nonetheless." Hollis flushed this time in sheer delight. Often though fortune had fooled him, yet she had not utterly quenched his faith in men. Thus, miraculously, in the 11th hour had salvation come to him, and had come through that precious ruby which a wise intuition had made him treasure so tenaciously. The Duke produced a purse of green silk netting, through the meshes of which glowed the mellow warmth of gold. "Meanwhile, my friend, as an earnest of my good intent." "Not that, your Grace." For the second time that day, Hollis waved back a proffered purse, his foolish pride in arms. Throughout his career, he had come by money in many questionable ways, but never by accepting it as a gift from one whose respect he desired to preserve. "I am in no such immediate want. I can contrive a while." But his Grace of Buckingham was of a different temper from his Grace of Albemarle. He was as prodigal and lavish as the other was parsimonious, and he was not of those who will take a refusal. He smiled a little at the colonel's protestations and passed to a tactful, ingratiating insistence with all the charm of which he could be master. "I honor you for your refusal, but—" He continued to hold out the purse. "See, it is not a gift I offer you, but an advance, a trifling loan, which you shall repay me presently when I shall have made it easy for you to so do. Come, sir, there is that between us which is not to be repaid in gold. Your refusal would offend me." And Hollis, be it confessed, was glad enough to have the path thus smooth for his self-respect. "As a loan, then, since you are so graciously insistent." "Why? What else do you conceive I had in mind?" His Grace dropped the heavy purse into a hand that was at last held out to receive it, and rose. "You shall hear from me again, Colonel, and as soon as may be. Let me but know where you are lodged." Hollis considered a second. He was leaving the Paul's Head, and it had been his announced intention to remove himself to the Bird in Hand, a humble hostelry where lodgings were cheap. But he loved good food and wine as he loved good raiment, and he would never lodge in so vile a house save under the harsh compulsion of necessity. Now, with this sudden accession of fortune, master of this heavy purse, and assured of more to follow soon, that obnoxious necessity was removed. He bethought him of, and decided upon, another house famous for its good cheer. "Your Grace will find me at the Harp in Wych Street," he announced. "There looked to hear from me, and very soon." They left the tavern together, and the Duke went off to his coach, which had been brought thither for him, his French lackeys trotting beside it, whilst Colonel Hollis, with his head in the clouds and a greater swagger than ever in his port to emphasize the shabby condition of his person, rolled along towards Paul's Yard, fingering the jewel in his ear, which there no longer was a need to sell, although there was no longer need to retain it, since it had fulfilled, at last, after long years, destiny's purpose with himself. Thus in high good humor he strutted into the Paul's Head, to plunge into a deplorable scene with Mrs. Quinn. It was a jewel, this fateful jewel, that precipitated catastrophe. The sight of it inflamed her anger, driving her incontinently to unwarranted conclusions. "You haven't sold it," she shrilled as he stepped into the back parlor where she was at the moment stirring, and she pointed to the earring, which glowed like an ember under a veil of his brown hair. "You've changed your mind. You think to come whimpering here again, that you may save the trinket at my cost." And then the devil whispered an unfortunate thought, and so begot in her a sudden furious jealousy. Before he could answer her, before he could recover from the gaping amazement in which he stood to receive the onslaught of her wrath, she was sweeping on, "I understand." She leered an instant evilly. "It's a love token, eh? The gift of some fat Flemish burgomaster's dame. Belike, whom ye no doubt cousin as you would have cousined me. That's why ye can't part with it. Not even to pay me the money you owe for bed and board, for the food ye guzzled, and the wine ye swillied. Ye good-for-nothing out-at-elbow jackanapes. But ye had your warning, and since ye don't heed it ye'll take the—" "Hold your peace, woman," he interrupted, thundering, and silenced her by a sudden show of passion. He advanced upon her, so that she recoiled in some alarm, yet bridling even then. Then as suddenly he checked, curbed himself, and laughed. Forth from his pocket, he lugged the heavy ducal purse, slid back the gold rings that bound it, and brought the broad yellow pieces into view at its gaping mouth. "What is the total of this score of yours?" he asked contemptuously, in the remnants of his anger. "Name it, take your money, and give me peace." But she was no longer thinking of her score. She was stricken with amazement at the sight of the purse he held, and the gold with which it bulged. Round-eyed, she stared at it, and then at him, and then, because she could not conjecture the source of this sudden wealth, she must assume the worst, with the readiness to which such minds as hers are prone. The suspicion narrowed her blue eyes. It settled into conviction, and fetched an unpleasant curl to the lips of her broad mouth. "And how come you by this gold?" she asked him, sinisterly quiet. "Is that your affair, ma'am?" "I thought you was above purse-cutting," she said, mightily disdainful. "But it seems I was as deceived in you there as in other ways." "Why, you impudent bawd!" he roared in his rage, and turned her livid by the epithet. "You vagrant muckrake! Is that a word for an honest woman? Honest, you thieving drab! Do you boast yourself honest? Your cheating score gives a lie to that. Give me the total of it, that I may pay the swindling sum, and shake the dust of your tavern from my heels." That, as you realize, was at the beginning of a scene of which I have no mind to give you all the details. Some of them are utterly unprintable. Her voice shrilled up like an oyster woman's, drawing the attention of the few who occupied the common room, and fetching Tim the drawer in alarm to the door of the little parlor. And for all his anger, Colonel Hollis began to be vaguely alarmed, for his conscience, as you know, was not altogether easy, and appearances might easily be construed against him. "You thieving, brazen traitor," she was bawling. "Do you think to come roaring it in here at me, you that have turned my reputable house into a den of treason? I'll learn you manners, you impudent gallows bird." And she then caught sight of Tim's scared face looking round the opening door. "Tim, fetch the constable," she bawled. "The gentleman shall shift his lodgings to Newgate, which is better suited to his kind. Fetch the constable, I tell you. Run, lad." Tim departed. So did the colonel, realizing suddenly that there would be no profit in remaining. He emptied the half of the contents of the ducal purse into his palm, and, as Jupiter wooed Danae, but without any of Jupiter's amorous intention, he scattered it upon and about her in a golden shower. "There's to stop your noisy, scolding mouth," he cried. "Pay yourself with that, you hag, and the devil take you." He flung out in a towering rage, almost on the very heels of Tim, and of the half-dozen men in the common room, not one dared to dispute his passage. He gained the street and was gone, leaving behind him some odds and ends of gear as a memento of his eventful passage, and a hostess reduced to tears of angry exhaustion. Chapter 14, Despair. For 3 weeks, Colonel Hollis waited in vain at the Harp in Wood Street for the promised message from His Grace of Buckingham, and his anxieties began to grow at last in a measure as he saw his resources dwindling, for he had practiced no husbanding of his comparatively slender funds. He was well lodged, ate and drank of the best, ruffled it in one or the other of 2 handsome suits which he had purchased from the second-hand clothiers in Birchin Lane, considering this more prudent and economical than a return to the shops of Paternoster Row, and he had even indulged with indifferent fortune a passion for gaming, which was one of his besetting sins. Hence, in the end, he found himself fretted by the continued silence of the Duke, who had led him into so confident a state of hope, and he had anxieties on another score. There was, he knew, a hue and cry set afoot by the vindictive fury of Mrs. Quinn, and it was solely due to the fact that his real whereabouts were unknown to her that he had escaped arrest. He was aware that search for him had been made at the Bird in Hand, whither he had announced to her his intention of removing himself. That the search had been abandoned, he dared not assume. At any moment it might result in his discovery and seizure, if it had not hitherto been more vigorously prosecuted. It was, he supposed, because there were other momentous matters to engage the public attention, for these were excited, uneasy days in London. On the 3rd of the month, the people had been startled in the city by the distant boom of guns, which had endured throughout the day to intimate that the Dutch and English fleets were engaged and rather alarmingly close at hand. The engagement, as you know, was somewhere off the coast in the neighborhood of Harwich, and it ended in heavy loss to the Dutch, who drew off back to the Texel. There were, of course, the usual exaggerations on both sides, and both English and Dutch claimed a complete victory and lighted bonfires. Our affair, however, is not with what was happening in Holland. In London from the June 8th, when first the news came of the complete rout of the Dutch and destruction of half their ships, until the 20th, which was appointed as a Thanksgiving Day for that great victory, there were high junketings over the business. Junketings which reached their climax at Whitehall on the 16th to welcome back the victorious Duke of York, returning from sea. As Mr. Pepys tells us, all fat and lusty and ruddy from being in the sun. And well it was, or perhaps not, that there should have been such excitements to keep the mind of the people diverted from the thing happening in their midst, to blind them to the spread of the plague, which, if slow, was nevertheless relentlessly steady, a foe likely to prove less easily engaged and beaten than the Dutch. After the wild public rejoicings of the 20th, people seemed suddenly to awaken to their peril. It may be that the sense of danger and dismay had its source in Whitehall, which was emptying itself rapidly now. The court removed itself to the more salubrious air of Salisbury, and throughout the day on the 21st, and again on the 22d, there was a constant westward stream of coaches and wagons by Charing Cross, laden with people departing from the infected town to seek safety in the country. That flight struck dismay into the city, whose inhabitants felt themselves in the position of mariners abandoned aboard a ship that is doomed. Something approaching panic ensued as a consequence of the orders promulgated by the Lord Mayor and the measures taken to combat the dread disease. Sir John Lawrence had been constrained to issue stringent regulations, to appoint examiners and searchers, and to take measures for shutting up and isolating infected houses. Measures so rigorous that they finally dispelled any remains of the fond illusion that there was immunity within the walls of the city itself. A wholesale flight followed. Never were horses in such request in London, and never did their hire command such prices, and daily now at Ludgate Aldgate, over London Bridge, and by every other exit from the city was there that same congestion of departing horsemen, pedestrians, coaches, and carts that had earlier been seen at Charing Cross. A sort of paralysis settled upon London life and the transaction of its business by the rapidly thinning population. In the suburbs, it was reported that men were dying like flies at the approach of winter. Preachers of doom multiplied, and they were no longer mocked or pelted with offal, but listened to in awe. And so reduced in ribaldry were the apprentices of London that they even suffered a madman to run naked through the streets about palls with cresset of live coals upon his head, screaming that the Lord would purge with fire the city of its sins. But Colonel Hollis was much too obsessed by his own affairs to be deeply concerned with the general panic. When at last he heard of the exodus from Whitehall, he bestirred himself to action, from fear lest his Grace of Buckingham, in whom his last hope now rested, should depart with the others. Therefore he ventured to recall himself in a letter to the Duke. For 2 days he waited in vain for a reply, and then, as despondency was settling upon him, came an added blow to quicken this into utter and absolute despair. He returned after dusk one evening from an expedition in the course of which he had sold at last that jewel which had now served whatever purpose he had fondly imagined that fate intended by it, so that his conversion into money was the last use to which it could be put. He had made an atrociously bad bargain, for these were not times, the buyer assured him, in which folk were thinking of adornments. As he re-entered the inn, Banks, the landlord, approached him and drew him on one side out of sight and earshot of the few who lingered in the common room. "There's been 2 men here seeking you, sir." Hollis started in eagerness, his mind leaping instantly to the Duke of Buckingham. Observing this, the landlord, grave-faced, shook his head. He was a corpulent, swarthy man of a kindly disposition, and it may be that this wistful guess of his had commanded instinctively his sympathy. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, although there was hardly the need. "They was messengers from Bow Street," he said. "They didn't say so, but I know them. They asked immortal questions. How long you had been in my house, and whence you came and what you did, and they ordered me at parting to say nothing about this to you. But—" The landlord shrugged his great shoulders and curled his lip in contempt of that injunction. His dark eyes were on the colonel, and he observed the latter's sudden gravity. Hollis was not exercised by any speculations on the score of the business that had brought those minions of justice. His association with Tucker and Rathbone had been disclosed, possibly at the trial of the former, who had just been convicted and sentenced to be hanged and quartered. And he had no single doubt that, if he once came within the talons of the law, his own conviction would follow, despite his innocence. "I thought, sir," the landlord was saying, "that I'd warn you, so that if so be you've done aught to place yourself outside the law, you shouldn't stay for them to take you. I don't want to see you come to no harm." Hollis collected himself. "Mr. Banks," he said, "you're a good friend, and I thank you. I have done nothing. Of that I can assure you. But appearances may be made to damn me. The unfortunate Mr. Tucker was an old friend of mine." The landlord's sigh interrupted him. Sir, I thought it might be that, from something they let fall. That's why I take the risk of telling you. In God's name, sir, be off whiles ye may." It took the colonel a little by surprise. Here for once fortune was his friend in that the landlord of the Harp was a secret sympathizer with the Republicans. He took the man's advice, paid his score, which absorbed most of the proceeds of the jewel, and, without so much as waiting to collect what gear he possessed, he set out at once from quarters grown suddenly so very dangerous. He was not a moment too soon. Even as he stepped into the gloom of the street, two shadowy forms loomed abruptly before him to bar his way. A lantern was suddenly uncovered and thrust into his face. "Stand, sir, in the king's name," a gruff voice commanded him. He could not see whether they had weapons in their hands or not, nor did he wait to ascertain. At a blow, he sent the lantern flying. At another, he felled a man who had advanced it. The arms of the second messenger wound themselves about his body, and the fellow steadied himself to throw him. But before that could happen, Hollis had knocked the breath out of the man's body by a jolt of his elbow, and, as the catchpole's arms slackened in their grip, he was flung off and violently hurled against the wall. As you conceive, Hollis did not stay to verify what damage he had done. He was off like a hare, down the dark street, whilst behind him came shouts and the patter of running feet. The pursuit was not long maintained, and presently the colonel was able with safety to resume a more leisurely and dignified progress. But fear went with him, driving him ever farther into the depths of the city, and it kept him company throughout the night. He lay in a tavern in the neighborhood of Aldgate and reflected grimly upon the choice position in which he found himself. Before dawn, he had reached the conclusion that there was but one thing for a sane man in his position to do, and that was to quit this England where he found nothing but bitterness and disappointment. He cursed the ill-conceived patriotism that had brought him home, pronounced love of country a delusion, and fools all those who yielded to it. He would depart at once, and never trouble this evil land of his birth again. Now that the Dutch were back in the Texel and the seas open once more, there need be no difficulty. Not even his lack of funds should prove an obstacle. He would ship as one of the hands aboard some vessel bound for France. With this intention, he made his way to Wapping betimes next morning. Vessels there were, and hands were needed, but no master would ship him until he had procured himself a certificate of health. The plague had rendered this precaution necessary, not only for those going abroad, but even for such as desire to go into the country, where no town or village now would receive any man who came from London unless he came provided with a certificate that pronounced him clean. It was a vexatious complication, but it must be accepted. So the colonel trudged wearily to the Guildhall, going by sparsely tenanted, darksome city streets, where he saw more than one door marked with cross and guarded by a watchman who warned all wayfarers to keep their distance. And the wayfarers, of whom he met by no means many, showed themselves eager enough to keep to the middle of the street, giving as wide a berth as possible, not only to those infected dwellings, but also to all persons whom they might chance to meet. Not a few of those whom Hollis found abroad were officials whose appointment the pestilence had rendered necessary. Examiners, searchers, keepers, and chirurgeons, each and all of them distinguishable at a glance by a red wand borne well displayed as the law prescribed, and all of them shunned as if they were themselves plague-stricken. It made the colonel realize the extent of the spread of this infection, which was now counting its victims by thousands. The extent of the panic he realized when he came at last to the Guildhall and found it besieged by coaches, sedan chairs, and a vast mob on foot. All here were come upon the same errand as himself, to procure the Lord Mayor's certificate of health that should enable them to escape from this stricken city. Most of the day he waited in that throng, enduring the stifling heat and the pangs of hunger and of thirst. For the only hawkers moving in the crowd were vendors of preventive medicines and amulets against the plague. Instead of the cry of sweet oranges, which in normal times would have been heard in such a gathering, and which he would now have welcomed, here the only cries were infallible preservative against infection, the royal antidote, sovereign cordial against the corruption of the air, and the like. He could ill afford to purchase the favor of the ushers and bribe them into according him some precedence. He must wait and take his turn with the humblest there, and, as he had arrived late, his turn did not seem likely to come that day at all. Towards evening, unlike the more prudent, who determined to remain in their ranks all night, that they might be among the first served next day, he departed empty-handed and disgruntled. Yet within the hour he was to realize that perhaps he had been better served by fate than he suspected. In a sparsely tenanted eating-house in Cheapside, where he sought to stay the pangs of thirst and hunger, for he had neither eaten nor drunk since early morning, he overheard some scraps of conversation between two citizens at a neighboring table. They were discussing an arrest that had been made that day, and in the course of this they let fall the words which gave pause to Colonel Hollis. But how was he taken? How discovered? One of them asked. Why? At the Guildhall, when he sought a certificate of health that should enable him to leave town. I tell you, it's none so easy to leave London nowadays, as evildoers are finding when they attempt it. Sooner or later they'll get Danvers this way. They're on the watch for him, aye, and for others too. Colonel Hollis pushed away his platter, his appetite suddenly dead. He was in a trap, it seemed, and it had needed those words overheard by chance to make him realize it. To attempt flight was but to court discovery. True, it might be possible to obtain a certificate of health in a false name, but on the other hand, it might not. There must be inquisition into a person's immediate antecedents, if only to verify that he was clean of infection, and this inquisition must speedily bring to light any prevarication or assumption of false identity. And so he was on the horns of a dilemma. If he remained in London, sooner or later he would be run to earth by those who sought him, who would be seeking him more relentlessly than ever now, after his manhandling of those messengers of the law last night. If he attempted to go, he delivered himself up to justice by the very act. He determined, after much gloomy cogitation, to seek the protection of Albemarle in this desperate pass, and with that intent went forth. He persisted in it until he reached Charing Cross. When a doubt assailed him, he remembered Albemarle's selfish caution. What if Albemarle should refuse to take the risk of believing his innocence, considering the nature of the alleged offense? He hardly thought that Albemarle would push caution quite so far, especially with the son of his old friend. Though it was a friend the Duke must have sown in these days. But because he perceived the risk, he hesitated, and finally determined at first he would make one last attempt to move the Duke of Buckingham. Acting upon that impulse, he turned into the courtyard of Wallingford House. Chapter 15, The Shadow of the Gallows. His Grace of Buckingham had not accompanied the court in its flight to Salisbury. His duties, indeed, recalled him to his Lord Lieutenancy in York. But he was as deaf to the voice of duty as to that of caution. He was held fast in London, in the thraldom of his passion for Miss Farquharson, and enraged because that passion prospered not at all. It had prospered less than ever since his attempt to play the hero and rescuer of beauty in distress had ended in making him ridiculous in the lady's eyes. It was his obsession on the score of Miss Farquharson that was responsible for his neglect of the letter that Hollis had written to him. That appeal had reached him at a moment when he was plunged into dismay by the news that Sir John Lawrence's orders had gone forth that all theaters and other places of assembly should close upon the following Saturday, as a very necessary measure in the Lord Mayor's campaign against the plague. The court was no longer present to oppose the order, and it is doubtful if it would have dared still to oppose it in any case. Now the closing of the theaters meant the withdrawal of the players from town, and with that the end of his Grace's opportunities. Either he must acknowledge defeat or else act promptly. One course, one simple and direct course, there was, which he would long ago have taken but for the pusillanimous attention he had paid to Mr. Etheridge's warning. In a manner the closing of the theater favored this course, and removed some of the dangers attending it, dangers which in no case would long have weighed with his Grace of Buckingham, accustomed as he was to flout all laws but those of his own desires. He took his resolve at last, and sent for the subtle Bates, who was a chaffinch of Wallingford House. He gave him certain commands, whose full purport Master Bates did not completely apprehend, in the matter of a house. That was on the Monday of the week, whose Saturday was to see the closing of the theaters. It was the very day on which Hollis made a precipitate departure from the Harp. On Tuesday morning, the excellent and resourceful Bates was able to report to his master that he had found precisely such a domicile as his grace required, though why his grace should require Bates could not even begin to surmise. It was a fairly spacious and excellently equipped dwelling in Knight Rider Street, lately vacated by a tenant who had removed himself into the country out of dread of the pestilence. The owner was a certain merchant in Fenchurch Street, who would be glad enough to let the place on easy terms, considering how impossible it was just at present to find tenants for houses in the city or its liberties. Bates had pursued his inquiries with characteristic discretion, as he now assured his grace, without allowing it to transpire on whose behalf he was acting. His grace laughed outright at the assurance, and all that it implied that Bates had taken for granted, Yuri growing a very competent scoundrel in my service. Bates bowed, not without a tinge of mockery. "I am glad to merit your grace's approval," said he dryly. There was a strain of humorous insolence in the fellow, of which the Duke was disposed to be tolerant, perhaps because nothing else was possible with one so intimately acquainted with his conscience. "Aye, Yuri a trustworthy rogue. The house will do admirably, though I should have preferred a less populous district. If things continue as at present, your grace should have no cause for complaint on that score. Soon the city will be the most depopulated spot in England. Already more than half the houses in Knight Rider Street are empty. I trust your grace is not thinking of residing there." Not exactly. His grace was frowning, thoughtfully. "There's no infection in the street, I hope?" "Not yet, but there's an abundant fear of it, as everywhere else in the city." This merchant in Fenchurch Street didn't trouble to conceal the opinion that I was crazy to be seeking a house in London at such a time. Pooh. His grace dismissed the matter of fear contemptuously. "These such frighten themselves into plague. It's opportune enough. It will serve to keep men's minds off the concerns of their neighbors. I want no spying on me in Knight Rider Street. Tomorrow, Bates, you'll seek this merchant and engage the house, and Yuri to acquire the tenancy of it in your own name. You understand? My name is not to be mentioned. To avoid questions, you'll pay him 6 months' rent at once." Bates bowed. "Perfectly, your grace." His grace leaned back in his great chair and considered his servant through half-closed, slyly smiling eyes. "You'll have guessed, of course, the purpose for which I am acquiring this house. I should never presume to guess any purpose of your grace's, by which you mean that my purpose baffles you. That is an admission of dullness. You recall the little comedy we played a month ago for the benefit of Miss Farquharson? I have occasion to. My bones are still sore from the cudgeling I got. It was a very realistic piece of acting on the part of your grace's cursed French grooms. The lady didn't think so. At least, it did not convince her. We must do better this time." "Yes, your grace." There was the least dubiety in the rascal's tone. "We'll introduce a more serious note into the comedy. We'll carry the lady off. That is the purpose for which I require this house." "Carry her off?" said Bates, his face grown suddenly very serious. "That is what I require of you, my good Bates." "Of me?" Bates gasped. His face lengthened, and his wolfish mouth fell open. "Of me, your grace?" He made it plain that the prospect scared him. "To be sure. What's to gape at? But, your grace, this is very serious." "Bah!" said his grace. It's a hanging matter." "Oh, damn your silliness. A hanging matter. When I'm behind you, that's what makes it so. They'll never venture to hang your grace. But they'll need a scapegoat if there's trouble, and they'll hang your instruments to pacify the rabble's clamor for justice. Are ye quite mad? I'm not only saying, your grace, I'm shrewd, and if I may presume to advise your grace, that would, indeed, be a presumption, you impudent rogue." The Duke's voice rose sharply. A heavy frown rumpled his brow. "You forget yourself, I think. I beg your grace's pardon." But he went on nonetheless. "Your grace, perhaps, is not aware of the extent of the panic in the city over this pestilence. The cry everywhere is that it is a visitation provoked by the sins of the court. That's what the canting nonconformist preachers have put about. And if this thing that your grace contemplates—" "My God!" thundered Buckingham. "But it seems you presume to advise me in spite of all." Bates fell silent, but there was obstinacy in every line of him as he stood there facing his master now. More calmly, Buckingham continued, "Listen, Bates, if we are ill-served on the one hand by the pestilence, we are very well served on the other. To carry Miss Farquharson off while she is playing at the theater would be to have a hue and cry set up at once that might lead to discovery and unpleasant consequences. But the Lord Mayor has ordered the closing of all theaters on Saturday, and it is on Saturday after theater, therefore, that this thing must be done, when Miss Farquharson will no longer be missed and her disappearance give rise to no excitement, particularly at a time when this very fear of the plague is giving people enough to think about. And afterwards, your grace, afterwards, when the lady makes complaint." Buckingham smiled in his knowledge of the world. Do ladies ever make complaints of this kind? Afterwards? Besides, who will believe her tale that she went to this house of mine against her will? She is an actress, remember, not a princess, and I still command some measure of authority in this country. But Bates solemnly shook his head. "I doubt if your grace commands enough to save my neck should there be trouble, and trouble there will be. Be sure of that, your grace. There's too many malcontents abroad. Spy the opportunity to make it." "But who's to accuse you?" cried the Duke impatiently. "The lady herself, if I carry her off for you. Besides, has not your grace said that the house is to be taken in my name? If more were wanted, that would supply it. I am your grace's very dutiful servant, and God knows I'm not over scrupulous on the score of my service. But not this, your grace. I durstn't." Amazement and scorn were blent on Buckingham's countenance. He wanted to explode in anger, and he wanted to laugh at the same time at the absurdity of finding an obstacle in Bates. His fingers drummed the table what time he reflected. Then he determined to cut the game short by playing trumps. "How long have you been in my service, Bates?" 5 years this month, your grace." "And you are tired of it?" Your grace knows that I am not. I have served you faithfully in all things. But you think the time has come when you may pick and choose the things in which you will serve me still. Bates, I think you have been in my service too long. Your grace, I may be mistaken, but I shall require proof before believing it. Fortunately for you, it lies within your power to afford me that proof. I advise you to do so." He looked at Bates coldly, and Bates looked back at him in dread. The little rascal fidgeted with his neckcloth, and his lean, knuckly hand for a moment caressed his throat. The gesture almost suggested that his thoughts were on the rope which he might be putting about that scraggy neck of his. "Your grace," he cried on a note of appeal, "there is no service I will not perform to prove my devotion. Command me to do anything, your grace, anything, but not this. I am touched, Bates, by your protestations." His grace was coldly supercilious. "Unfortunately, this is the only service I desire of you at the moment." Bates was reduced to despair. "I can't, your grace. I can't," he cried. "It is a hanging matter, as your grace well knows. For me, Bates, at strict law, I believe it might be," said the Duke indifferently. "And since your grace is too high for hanging, it's me that would have to be your deputy. How you repeat yourself. A tiresome habit. And you but confirm me in my opinions. Yet there might be £100 or so for you as a dosor. It isn't money, your grace. I wouldn't do it for 1,000. Then there is no more to be said." Inwardly, Buckingham was very angry. Outwardly, he remained icily cold. "You have leave to go, Bates, and I shall not further require your services. If you will apply to Mr. Grove, he will pay you what moneys may be due to you." A wave of the white jeweled hand dismissed the crestfallen little scoundrel. A moment Bates wavered, hesitating, swayed by his reluctance to accept dismissal. But not even that reluctance could conquer his dread of the consequences, a dread based upon conviction that they could not fail to overtake him. Had it been anything less than a hanging matter, he might have risked it, but this was too much. So, realizing that further pleadings or protestations would be wasted upon the cold arrogance of Duke, he bowed in silence, and in silence removed himself. If he withdrew in discomfiture, at least he left discomfiture behind him. The Duke's trump card had failed to win him the game, and he knew not where to find another agent for the enterprise which now obsessed him. Mr. Etheridge coming later that day to visit him, found his Grace still in a bedgown, pacing the handsome library, restless as a caged beast. Mr. Etheridge, who well knew the attraction that held the Duke fast in town, and who had, himself, just completed his preparations for departure, came to make the last of several recent attempts to recall his friend to his senses and persuade him to leave London for healthier surroundings. Buckingham laughed at him without mirth. "You alarm yourself without occasion, George. This pestilence is born of uncleanliness and confines itself to the unclean. Look into the cases that are reported. The outbreaks are all in mean houses and mean streets. The plague practices a nice discrimination and does not venture to intrude upon persons of quality. Nevertheless, I take my precautions," said Mr. Etheridge, producing a handkerchief from which a strong perfume of camphor and vinegar diffused itself through the room. "And I am one of those who believe that flight is the best physic. Besides, what is there to do here? The court is gone. The town is hot and reeking as an anteroom of hell. In heaven's name, let us seek a breath of clean, cool country air. Pish, yeary bucolic. Like Dryden Yeavy, a pastoral mind. Well, be off to your sheep. We shall not miss you here." Mr. Etheridge sat down and studied his friend, pursing his lips. And all this for a prude who has no notion of being kind. "Let me perish, Bucks. But I don't know you." The Duke fetched a sigh. "Sometimes I think I don't know myself. Gad, George, I believe I'm going mad." He strode away to the window. "Comfort yourself with the reflection that you won't have far to go," said the unsympathetic Mr. Etheridge. "How a man of your years and experience can take the risks and the trouble over pursuit that—" The Duke swung round to interrupt him sharply. "Pursuit? That is a cursed word. A pursuit that maddens because it never overtakes." "Not a bad line, that for you," said Mr. Etheridge. "But in love, remember, they fly that wound and they pursue that die." But Buckingham raved on without heeding the jibe, his voice suddenly thick with passion. "I have the hunter's instinct, I suppose. The prey that eludes me is a prey that at all costs must be reduced into possession. Can't you understand? No, thank God. I happen to retain my sanity. Come into the country, man, and recover yours. It's waiting for you there amid the buttercups." "Pshaw!" Buckingham turned from him again with an ill-humored shrug. "Is that your answer?" "It is. Don't let me detain you." Etheridge got up and went to set a hand upon his arm. "If you stay, and at such a time, you must have some definite purpose in your mind. What is it?" "What was in my mind before you came to trouble it, George? To end the matter where I should have begun it." And he adapted 3 lines of Suckling's. Etheridge shrugged in despair and disgust. "Ye're not only mad, Bucks," said he. "Ye're coarse. I warned you once of the dangers of this thing. I've no mind to repeat myself. But you'll give me leave to marvel that you can take satisfaction in—" "Marvel all you please." The other interrupted him with a touch of anger. "Perhaps, indeed, I am a matter for marvel. I am a man racked, consumed, burned up by my feelings for this woman who has scorned and spurned and made a mock of me. If I could believe in her virtue, I would go my ways, bending to her stubborn will. But virtue in an actress, it is as likely as snow in hell. She indulges a cruel and perverse zest to torture a man whom she sees perishing of love for her." He paused a moment, to pursue with even greater fierceness, his face livid with the working of the emotion that possessed him, that curious and fearful merging of love and hatred that is so often born of baffled passion. "I could tear the jade limb from limb with these 2 hands and take joy in it. I could so, or with the same joy I could give my body to the rack for her sweet sake. To such an abject state have her wiles reduced me." He swung away and went to fling himself petulantly into a chair, taking his blond head in his fine jewel hands. After that explosion, Mr. Etheridge decided that there was nothing to be done with such a man but abandon him to his fate. He said so with engaging candor and took his leave. His Grace made no attempt to detain him, and for some time after his departure sat there alone in that somber book-lined room, a fool enshrined in wisdom and learning. Gloomily he brooded the matter, more than ever exasperated by the defection of Bates, and the consideration that he was left thereby without a minister to assist him in the execution of his wishes. He was disturbed at last by the appearance of a footman, who brought the announcement that a Colonel Hollis was demanding insistently to see his grace. Irritated, Buckingham was about to pronounce dismissal. Say that. He checked. He remembered the letter received 3 days ago, and its urgent appeal. That awoke an idea, and set his grace speculating. Wait! He moistened his lips, and his eyes narrowed in thought. Slowly they lighted from their gloom. Abruptly he rose. Bring him in, he said. Hollis came, erect and soldierly a figure, still tolerably dressed, but very haggard now of countenance at the end of that weary day spent between Wapping and the Guildhall with the sense that he was being hunted. Your grace will forgive, I trust, my importunities, he excused himself, faltering a little. But the truth is that my need, which was very urgent when I wrote, has since grown desperate. Buckingham considered him thoughtfully from under his bent brows without directly replying. He dismissed the waiting footman and offered his visitor a chair. Hollis sat down wearily. His grace remained standing, his thumbs hooked into the girdle of his bedgown. I received your letter, he said in his slow, pleasant voice. From my silence, you may have supposed that you had passed from my mind. That is not so, but you realize, I think, that you are not an easy man to help. Less than ever now, said Hollis grimly. What's that? There was a sudden, unmistakable quickening of the Duke's glance, almost as if he welcomed the news. Hollis told him without preamble. And so your grace perceives, he ended, that I am now not only in danger of starving, but of hanging. His grace had not moved throughout the rendering of that account. Now at last he stirred. He turned from his visitor and sauntered slowly away in thought. But what an imprudence, he said at last, for a man in your position to have had relations, however slight, with these wretched Fifth Monarchy dogs. It is to put a halter about your neck. Yet there was no wrong in those relations. Tucker was an old brother-in-arms. Your grace has been a soldier and knows what that means. It is true that he tempted me with proposals. I admit it, since that can no longer hurt him. But those proposals I incontinently refused. His grace smiled a little. Do you imagine that the justices will believe you when you come to tell them that? Seeing that my name is Randall Hollis, and that a vindictive government will be glad of any pretext to stretch the neck of my father's son, I do not. That is why I describe my state as desperate. I am a man moving in the shadow of the gallows. S.H., the Duke reproved him gently. You must not express yourself in such terms, Colonel. Your very tone savors of disloyalty, and you are unreasonable. If you were really loyal, there was a clear duty which you would not have neglected. When first this proposal was made to you, whatever your friendship for Tucker, you should have gone straight to the justices and laid information of this plot. Your grace advises something that in my own case you would not have performed. But even had I acted so, how should I have compelled belief? I knew no details of this plot. I was not in a position to prove anything. It would have been my bare word against Tucker's, and my name alone would have discredited me. My action might have been regarded as an impudent attempt to earn the favor of the powers in being. It might even, in some tortuous legal manner, have been construed against me. Therefore I held my peace. Your assurance is enough for me, said his grace amiably. And God knows I perceive your difficulty, and how you have been brought into your present danger. Our first care must be to deliver you from this. You must do at last what should have been done long since. You must go before the justices, and frankly state the case as you have stated it to me. But your grace yourself has just said that they will not believe me. His grace paused in his pacing and smiled a little slyly. They will not believe your unsupported word. But if some person of eminence and authority were to answer for your good faith, they would hardly dare to doubt. The matter would be at an end, and there will be no further question of any impeachment. Hollis stared, suddenly hopeful, and yet not daring to yield entirely to his hope. Your grace does not mean that you would do this for me? His grace's smile grew broader, kindlier. But, of course, my friend, if I am to employ you, as I hope I shall, so much would be a necessary preliminary. Your grace. Hollis bounded to his feet. How to thank you? His grace waved him back again to his chair. I will show you presently, my friend. There are certain conditions I must impose. There is a certain task I shall require of you. Your grace should know that you have but to name it. Ah! The Duke paused and again considered him intently. You said in your letter that you were ready for any work, for any service. I said so. Yes, I say so again. Ah. Again that soft, relieved exclamation. Then the Duke paced away to the book-lined wall and back again before continuing. My friend, your despair comes opportunely to my own. We are desperate both, though in different ways, and it lies within the power of each to serve the other. If I could believe that, you may. The rest depends upon yourself. He paused a moment, then on a half-humorous note proceeded. I do not know how much a squeamishness of what men call honesty your travels and misfortune may have left you. None that your grace need consider, said Hollis, with some self-derision. That is very well. Yet you may find the task distasteful. I doubt it. God knows I'm not fastidious nowadays. But if I do, I will tell you so. Just so. The Duke nodded, and then, perhaps because of the hesitation that still beset him to make to Hollis the proposal that he had in mind, his manner suddenly hardened. It was almost that of the great gentleman speaking to his lackey. That is why I warn you. For should you wish to tell me so, you will please to tell me without any unnecessary roaring, without the airs of Bobadil or a pistol, or any other of your fire-eating, down-at-heel fraternity. You have but to say no, and spare me the vaporings of outrage virtue. Hollis stared at the man in silence for a moment, utterly dumbfounded by his tone. Then he laughed a little. It would surprise me to discover that I've any virtue left to outrage. All the better, snapped the Duke. He drew up a chair and sat down, facing Hollis. He leaned forward. In your time, no doubt you have played many parts, Colonel Hollis. I am more to parts. Have you ever played Sir Pandarus of Troy? The Duke keenly watched his visitor's face for some sign of understanding. But the Colonel's classical education had been neglected. I've never heard of him. What manner of part may that be? His Grace did not directly answer. He took another way to his ends. Have you ever heard of Sylvia Farquharson? Surprised anew, it was a moment before the Colonel answered him. Sylvia Farquharson? He echoed, musing. I've heard the name. Oh, I have it. That was a lady in a sedan chair your Grace rescued yonder in Paul's Yard on the day we met. I heard her named at the time. A baggage of a play actress from the Duke's house, I think. But what has she to do with us? Something, I think, unless the stars are wrong. And the stars are never wrong. They stand immutable and true in a false and fickle world. It is written in them, as I have already told you, that we were to meet again, you and I, and be jointly concerned in a fateful matter with one other. That other, my friend, is this same Sylvia Farquharson. He rose, casting off all reserve at last, and his pleasant voice was thickened by the stress of his emotions. You behold in me a man exerting vast power for good and ill. There are in life few things, however great, that I desire without being able to command them. Sylvia Farquharson is one of these few things. With affectations of prudery, this wanton keeps me on the rack. That is where I require your help. He paused. The Colonel stared at him round-eyed. A faint color stirred in his haggard cheeks. At last he spoke, in a voice that was cold and level. Your Grace has hardly said enough. Dullard, what more is to be said? Don't you understand that I mean to make an end of the situation, to conquer the prudish airs with which this wanton jade repels me? Faith, I think I understand that well enough. Hollis laughed a little. What I don't understand is my part in this, a doxy business of this kind. Will not your Grace be plain? Plain? Why, man, I want her carried off from me. They sat conning each other in silence now, the Colonel's face utterly blank, so that the Duke looked in vain for some sign of how he might be taking this proposal. At last his lips curled in a rather scornful smile, and his voice drawled with a mildly humorous inflection. But in such a matter your Grace's own vast experience should surely serve you better than could I. In his eagerness, the Duke took him literally, never heeding the sarcasm. My experience will be there to guide you. I see, said Hollis. I'll tell you more precisely how I need you, where you can serve me. And Buckingham proceeded to inform him of the well-equipped house in Knight Rider Street, which he now desired Hollis to take in his own name. Having taken it, He was to make the necessary arrangements to carry the girl thither on the evening of Saturday next, after the last performance at the Duke's house. Taking what men you need, the Duke concluded, it should be easy to waylay and capture a chair as it is being borne home. We will consider that more closely if the service is one that you are disposed to accept. The colonel's face was flushed. He felt his gorge rising. At last his anger mastered him, and he heaved himself up to confront the handsome profligate who dared in cold blood to make him this proposal. "My God," he growled, "are you led by your vices like a blind man by his dog?" The Duke stepped back before the sudden menace of that tone and mien. At once he wrapped himself in a mantle of arrogance. "I warned you, sir, that I will suffer no heroics, that I will have no man play Bobadil to me. You ask service of me. I have shown you how I can employ you." "Service?" echoed Hollis, his voice almost choked with anger. "Is this service for a gentleman? Perhaps not, but a man standing in the shadow of the gallows should not be over-fastidious." The flush perished in the colonel's face. The haunting fear returned to his eyes. The Duke, seeing him thus suddenly stricken by that grim reminder, was moved to sudden laughter. "It seems you have to realize, Colonel Hollis, that there is no music without frets. You resent that I should ask a trifling service of you when in return I am offering to make your fortune. For that is what I am offering. You come as opportunely to my need as to your own. Serve me as I require, and I pledge you my word that I shall not neglect you. But this, faltered Hollis, protesting. It is a task for bullies, for jackals." The Duke shrugged. "Damn, why trouble to define it?" Then he changed his tone again. "The choice is yours. Fortune makes the offer, gold on the one hand, hemp on the other. I do not press either upon you." Hollis was torn between fear and honor. In imagination, he felt already the rope about his neck. He beheld that wasted life of his finding a fitting consummation on Tyburn at the hands of Derrick. Thus fear impelled him to accept. But the old early notions that had inspired his ambition and had made him strive to keep his honor clean rose up to hold him back. His tortured thoughts evoked an image of Nancy Sylvester, as he had last seen her sit in the frame of her casement, and he conceived the shame and horror in that face because she would hold him engaged upon so loathly an enterprise. He who had gone forth so proudly to conquer the world for her. Many a time in the past had that image delivered him from the evil to which he was tempted. "I'll go my ways, I think," he said heavily, and half turned as if to depart. "You know whither it leads?" came the Duke's warning voice. "I care not an apple paring." "As you please." In silence Hollis bowed, and made his way to the door with dragging feet. Hope's last bubble pricked, and then the Duke's voice arrested him again. "Hollis, you are a fool. I have long known it. I was a fool when I saved your life, and you pay me as a fool should be paid. You pay yourself, and of your own choice you do so in fool's coin." Seeing him standing arrested there, still hesitating, the Duke approached him. His Grace's need, as you know, was very urgent. It was no overstatement that Hollis's coming had been opportune. Unless he could make of Hollis the tool that he required so sorely, where should he find another? It was because of this he decided to use yet some persuasion to conquer a frame of mind that was obviously still balancing. He set a friendly hand upon the colonel's shoulder, and Hollis, shrinking almost under that touch, could not guess that this Duke, who sought to make a tool of him, was himself the blind tool of destiny, hewing away to her inscrutable ends. And whilst the Duke now talked persuasively, tempting him with promises on the one hand and intimidating him with a picture of what must otherwise happen on the other, the colonel's own tormented mind was reconsidering. Were his hands really so clean, his life so blameless, his honor so untarnished, that he must boggle at this vileness, and boggle at it to the extent of allowing him to stretch his neck and disembowel him sooner than perform it? And what was this vileness when all was said? A baggage of the theater, a troll of an actress, had played upon the Duke that she might make the greater profit out of him in the end. The Duke, wearied of her tricks and wiles, desired to cut the game short. Thus the Duke represented the situation. And what cause had Hollis to assume that it was other than a true representation? The girl was an actress, and therefore it followed, wanton, the puritanical contempt of the playhouse and its denizens, heritage of his Commonwealth days, left him no doubt upon that score. If she were a lady of quality, a woman of virtue, the thing would be different. Then, indeed, to be a party to such an act were a wickedness unthinkable, a thing sooner than which he would, indeed, suffer death. But where was the vileness here, since the object itself was vile? Against what, then, really did this thing offend? Against himself, against his soldier's dignity. The act required of him was one proper to a hired bully. It was ignoble, but was hanging less ignoble? Was he to let them put a rope about his neck and the brand of the gallows on his name out of tenderness for a baggage of the theater whom he did not even know? Buckingham was right. He was a fool. All his life he had been a fool, scrupulous in trifles, negligent in the greater things. And now upon the most trifling scruple of all, he would fitly sacrifice his life. Abruptly he swung round and squarely faced the Duke. "Your Grace," he said hoarsely, "I am your man." Chapter 16, The Sedan Chair. His Grace behaved generously, and at the same time with a prudence which reveals the alert and calculating mind of this gifted man, who might have been great had he been less of a voluptuary. He attended with Hollis before the justices early on the morrow, announcing himself able to confirm out of his own knowledge the truth of the account which the colonel gave of his relations with the attainted Tucker. To that his Grace added the assertion that he was ready, if more were needed, to stand surety for the loyalty of the suspected man whom he now pronounced his friend. More was not needed. The sycophantic court bent the knee before this great gentleman who enjoyed the close friendship of his king, and even professed regret that certain reckless and malicious statements should have deceived it into troubling the peace of Colonel Hollis, and putting his Grace of Buckingham to the present inconvenience. The colonel's antecedents, which, without Buckingham's protection, might have been the gravest source of trouble, were not so much as touched upon. There was in all this nothing in the least unreasonable. Had the offense of which Colonel Hollis was suspected been anything less than treason, it is not to be supposed that the Duke would have been able to carry matters with quite so high a hand. But it was utterly unthinkable that his Grace of Buckingham, whose loyalty stood so high, whose whole life bore witness to his deep attachment to the House of Stuart, and who was notoriously one of His Majesty's closest and most intimate companions, should offer to stand surety for a man against whom the merest suspicion of disloyalty would be justified. Thus, at the outset, was Hollis delivered from his worst peril. Next, he was informed that, since service of any distinction in England was almost out of the question for his father's son, Buckingham would supply him with letters to several high-placed friends of his own in France, where a capable soldier well recommended need never lack employment. If Colonel Hollis made the most of the opportunity thus afforded him, his future should be assured and his days of adversity at an end. This Hollis clearly perceived for himself, and the reflection served to stifle any lingering qualms of conscience over the unworthy nature of the immediate service to which he was committed, and to assure him that he would, indeed, have been a fool had he permitted any mawkish sentimentality to deprive him of this the greatest opportunity of all his life. In this resolve to send Hollis out of England the moment the service required of him should be accomplished, Buckingham again reveals his astuteness. Further, he reveals in the fact that to assist the colonel, he placed at his disposal for the French lackeys in his pay. It was his intention to repatriate them, packing them off to France together with Hollis, as soon as the thing were done. Thus, in the event of any trouble afterwards with the law, he would have removed the only possible witnesses. The unsupported word of Miss Farquharson, even in the extreme, and in his Grace's view unlikely, event of her not accepting the situation, would be the only thing against him. And in that case he did not think that he need gravely apprehend the accusations of an actress, which he would have no great difficulty in answering. From attendance before the justices, Colonel Hollis repaired straight to Fenchurch Street to conclude arrangements with the owner of the house in Knight Rider Street. Of this he now acquired the tenancy in his own name for the term of 1 year. The merchant did not trouble to conceal the fact that he regarded Colonel Hollis as crazy to desire to take up his residence in an infected city from which all who were able were making haste to remove themselves. Had the colonel needed a reminder of it, he had it in the fact that he was constrained to go on foot, not only because hackney coaches were now rare, but because the use of them was considered highly imprudent, since so many had been used by infected persons. Doors smeared with the Red Cross and guarded by watchmen were becoming commonplaces, and comparatively few people met in the streets who still sought to maintain the normal tenor and business of their lives, moved with the listlessness of despondency or else with the watchfulness of hunted creatures. The pungent smell of electuaries, and particularly of camphor, was wafted to the colonel's nostrils from the person of almost every man he met. He may have thought again that, as he had already admirably expressed it, Buckingham was led by his passion like a blind man by his dog, to come thrusting himself at such a time into the city, and he may have taken satisfaction in the thought that he himself, so soon as his business should be accomplished, was to shake the poisonous dust of London from his feet. Matters concluded with a merchant. The colonel went to take possession of the house, and he installed there 2 of the 4 French lackeys the Duke had lent him for myrmidons. After that there was little to do but wait until Saturday, since, for reasons which the Duke had given him, the attempt should not be made before. That evening, however, and the next, the colonel repaired to Lincoln's and to watch from a safe distance Miss Farquharson's departure from the theater, and so inform himself precisely of her habits in the matter. On both occasions she came forth at the same time, a few minutes after 7, and entered her waiting sedan chair, in which she was borne away. On Friday evening Hollis went again, at 6 o'clock, and he had been waiting half an hour before the chair that was to convey her home made its appearance. It was the same chair as before and borne by the same men. Hollis lounged forward to engage them in talk. Of set purpose, and despite the warm weather, he had donned a well-worn leather jerkin to cover and conceal his fairly presentable coat. He had removed the feather from his hat and all minor ornaments, replacing his embroidered baldric by one of plain leather. A pair of old boots completed the studied shabbiness of his appearance, and gave him the air of a down-at-heel ruffler, ready to make a friend of any man. He slouched toward the chairman, pulling at a clay pipe, a man with time on his hands. And they, sitting on the shafts of the chair, one on each side, so as to balance each other, were nothing loath to have the tedium of their waiting beguiled by the phrasonical garrulousness his appearance led them to expect. He did not disappoint them. He talked of the pestilence and of the war, and of the favoritism practiced at court, which bestowed commands upon all manner of incompetent fops, and kept a hardened and stout old soldier like himself cooling his heels in London's plague-ridden streets. In this last respect he made them find him ridiculous, so that they rallied and covertly mocked him and hugely enjoyed themselves at his expense, to all which it appeared to them that his monstrous ruffler's vanity made him blind. Finally he invited them to come and drink with him, and they were nothing reluctant to permit him thus to add physical to the mental entertainment he had already afforded them. In their spirit of raillery, and to involve this foolish fellow in the utmost expense, they would have conducted him to the Grange. But the foolish fellow had more reasons than one for preferring an obscure little ale-house at the corner of Portugal Row, and it was thither that he now conducted his newly made friends and guests. When at last they parted, the chairman compelled to it by the necessity to be back at their post by 7 o'clock, it was with voluble protestations of friendship on the part of Hollis. He must come and see them soon again, he vowed. They were fellows after his own heart, he assured them. Eagerly they returned the compliment, and, as they made their way back to the theater, they laughed not a little over the empty vanity of that silly pigeon, and their own wit and cleverness in having fooled him to the top of his ridiculous bent. It might have given their hilarity pause could they have seen the grimly cunning smile that curled the lips of that same silly pigeon as he trudged away from the scene of their blithe encounter. On the following evening, which was at a Saturday, you behold him there again, at about the same hour, joyously hailed by Miss Farquharson's chairman, in a manner impudently blending greeting with derision. "Good evening, Sir John," cried one, and "Good evening, my lord," the other. The colonel, whose swaggering carriage was suggestive of mild intoxication, planted his feet wide, and regarded the twain owlishly. "I am not Sir John, and I am not my lord," he reproved them, whereupon they laughed. "Though, mark you," he added more ponderously, "mark you, I might be both if I had my dues. There's many a Whitehall pimp is my lord with less claim to the dignity than I have. Aye, a deal less." "Any fool can see that to look at you," said Jake. "Aye, any fool," said Nathaniel, sardonic and ambiguous. The colonel evidently chose the meaning that was flattering to himself. "You're good fellows," he commended them. "Very good fellows." And abruptly he added, "What should you say now to a cup of sack?" Their eyes gleamed. Had it been ale, they would have assented gladly enough. But sack, that was a nobleman's drink that did not often come their lowly way. They looked at each other. "Ed Jake?" questioned one. "A skew o' buzz'll never hurt, Nat," said the other. That it won't, Nat agreed. And there's time to spare this evening. Her ladyship will be packing a while. They took the colonel between them, and with arms linked the three set a course for the little alehouse at the corner of Portugal Row. The colonel was more garrulous than ever and very confidential. He had met a friend. He insisted upon informing them, an old brother-in-arms who had come upon fortunate days, from whom he had succeeded in borrowing a good round sum, extending his confidence. He told them that probably it would be many days before he would be perfectly sober again. To this he added renewed assurances that he found them both very good fellows, lively companions these plaguey days, when the town was as dull as a nunnery, and he swore that he would not be separated from them without a struggle. Into the alehouse they rolled, to be skillfully piloted by the colonel into a quiet corner, well away from the windows and the light. He called noisily, tipsily, for the landlady, banging the table with the hilt of his sword, and when she made her appearance, he silenced her protests by his order, 3 pints of canary stiffly laced with brandy. As she departed, he pulled up a 3-legged stool and sat down facing the chairmen, who were licking their chops in anticipatory delight. "Est ne every day we meet a brother-in-arms who's normally fortunate, but willing share fortune. The wine, madam, and of your best." Well said, old dog of war. Nat approved him, whereupon the twain abandoned themselves to uproarious laughter. The wine was brought, and the facetious pair swillied it greedily, whereafter they praised it. With rolling of eyes and resounding lip-smackings, they even subdued their raillery to the provider of this nectar. When he proposed a second pint, they actually grew solemn, and when after that he called for a third, they were almost prepared to treat him with respect. There was a vacuousness in the eyes with which he pondered them, swaying never so slightly on his 3-legged stool. "Why, you stare at me like he challenged them. They looked up from the replenished, but as yet untasted measures. His manner became suddenly stern. "Perhaps you think I haven't money pay for all this swill?" An awful dread assailed them both. He seemed to read it in their glances. "Why, you rogues, d'ye dare doubt gentleman? D'ye think gentleman calls for wine and can't pay? Here's to put your lousy minds at rest." Violently he pulled a hand from his pocket, and violently he flung it forward under their noses. Opening it as he did so, gold leapt from it, a half-dozen pieces that rolled and rang upon greasy table and greasier floor. In a flash, instinctively, the pair dived after them and grovelled there on hands and knees about the table's legs, hunting the scattered coins. When at length they came up again, each obsequiously placed 2 pieces before the colonel. "Your honor should be more careful handling gold," said Jake. "Ye might ha' lost a piece or 2, added Nat. "In some companies I might," said the colonel, looking very wise. "But I know Hone's fellows. I know how to choose my friends. Trust a captain fortune for that." He picked up the coins with clumsy, blundering fingers. "I thank you," he said, and restored them to his pocket. Jake winked at Nat, and Nat hid his face in his tankard lest a grin, which he could not suppress, should be perceived by the colonel. The pair were spending a very pleasant and profitable evening with this stray and thirsty Rhodomont. They drank noisily, and repeatedly Jake smacked his lips thereafter, frowning a little as he savored the draught. "I don't think it's as good as the last," he complained. The colonel picked up his own tankard with solicitude and took a pull at it. "I have drunk better," he boasted, "but scoot enough and just the same as last. Just the same." "Maybe my fancy," said Jake, at which his companion nodded. Then the colonel fell to talking volubly, boastfully. The landlady, who began to mislike their looks, drew near. The colonel beckoned her nearer still, and thrust a piece of gold into her hand. "Let that pay the reckoning," said he, very magnificent. She gaped at such prodigality, dropped him a curtsy, and withdrew again at once, reflecting that appearances can be very deceptive. The colonel resumed his talk, whether from the soporific dreariness of this or from the potency of the libations. Jake's eyelids were growing so heavy that he appeared to have a difficulty in keeping them from closing, whilst Nat was hardly in better case. Presently, surrendering to the luxurious torpor that pervaded him, Jake folded his arms upon the table and laid his sleepy head upon them. At this, his fellow took alarm and leaned across in an attempt to rouse him. Hi, Jake. We got her Carrie, ladyship home. Damn her ladyship, grunted Jake in the very act of falling asleep. With dazed eyes, Nat looked helplessly at the colonel and shaped his lips to utterance by a visible effort. Too much drink, he said thickly. Not used, wine. He made a feeble attempt to rise, failed, and then suddenly resigned himself. Like Jake, who was already snoring, he made on the table a pillow of his arms and lowered his head to it. In a moment, both the chairmen were soundly asleep. Colonel Hollis softly pushed back his stool and rose. A moment he stood considering whether he should recover the 2 or 3 gold pieces, which he was perfectly aware the rogues had filched from him. In the end, he concluded that this would be an unnecessary additional cruelty. He lurched out of the corner, and the hostess, hearing him move, came forward. He took her by the arm with one hand, whilst with the other, to her amazement, he pressed a second gold piece into her palm. He closed one eye solemnly and pointed to the sleeping twain. Very good fellows, friends o' mine, he informed her. Very drunk. Not used. Wine. Let 'em sleep in peace. She smirked, clutching that second precious piece. Indeed, your honor, they may sleep and welcome. You be paid for their lodgings. Hollis considered her critically. Goo woman. Ye're a goo woman. He considered her further. Handsome woman. Let 'em sleep in peace. God bless you. She thought a kiss was coming, but he disappointed her. He loosed her arm, reeled away a little, swung round, and lurched out of the place and off down the street. Having gone some little way, he halted unsteadily and looked back. He was not observed. Having assured himself of this, he resumed his way, and it is noteworthy that he no longer staggered. His step was now brisk and certain. He flung something from him as he went, and there was a faint tinkle of shivering glass. It was a phial that had contained the powerful narcotic which he had added to his guest's wine, whilst they were groveling for the money he had spilled. Animals, he said contemptuously, and upon that dismissed them from his mind. The hour of 7 was striking from St. Clement's Danes as he passed the back door of the playhouse and the untended chair that waited there for Miss Farquharson. Farther down the narrow street a couple of men were lounging who at a little distance might have been mistaken for the very chairman he had left slumbering in the alehouse. Their plain liveries at least were very similar, and they were covered with broad round hats identical with those of Miss Farquharson's bearers, worn at an angle that left their faces scarcely visible. Sauntering casually, Colonel Hollis came up with them. The street thereabouts was practically untenanted. Is all well? He asked them. The people have quitted the theater some 10 minutes since. One of them answered him in indifferent English. To your places, then. You know your tale if there are any questions. They nodded and lounged along, eventually to lean against a theater wall in the neighborhood of the chair, obviously its bearers. The tale they were to tell at need was that Jake had been taken ill. It was feared that he was seized with the plague. Nat, who was remaining with him, had begged these two to take their places with the chair. Hollis took cover in the doorway, whence he could watch the scene of action, and there disposed himself to wait. The vigil proved a long one. As Jake had remarked to his companion, Miss Farquharson was likely to be late in leaving. On this, the final evening at the Duke's Theater, she would have packing to do, and there would perhaps be protracted farewells among the players. Of the latter, several had already emerged from that little doorway and had departed on foot. Still Miss Farquharson did not come, and already the evening shadows began to deepen in the street. If Colonel Hollis was exercised by a certain impatience on the one hand, on the other, he was comforted by the reflection that there was gain to his enterprise and delay. The thing he had to do would be better accomplished in the dusk, best, indeed, in the dark. So he waited, and Buckingham's 2 French lackeys, disguised as chairmen, waited also. They had the advantage of knowing Miss Farquharson by sight, having twice seen her at close quarters, once on the occasion of her visit to Wallingford House, and again on the day of her mock rescue in Paul's Yard. At last, at a little after 8:30, when already objects were become indistinctly visible at a little distance, she made her appearance in the doorway. She came accompanied by Mr. Betterton, and was followed by the theater doorkeeper. She paused to deliver to the latter certain instructions in the matter of her packages. Then Mr. Betterton escorted her gallantly to her chair. The chairmen were already at their places, to which they had sprung immediately upon her coming forth. One, standing behind the chair, by raising its hinge roof made of this a screen for himself. The other, by the four shafts, endeavored to find cover beside the body of the chair itself. Gathering her hooded cloak about her, she stepped into sedan. Betterton bowed low over her hand in valediction. As he stood back, the chairman in front closed the apron, whilst the one behind lowered the roof. Then, taking their places between the shafts, they raised the chair and began to move away with it. From within, Miss Farquharson waved a delicate hand to Mr. Betterton, who stood bowing, bareheaded. Chapter 17, The Abduction. The chair swung past the grotesque wooden structure of Temple Bar and along Fleet Street in the deepening dusk of that summer evening. And this being the normal way it should have taken, there was so far nothing to alarm its occupant. But as its bearers were about to turn to the right, to plunge into the narrow alley leading down to Salisbury Court, a man suddenly emerged from that black gulf to check their progress. The man was Hollis, who had gained the place ahead of them. "Back!" he called to them as he advanced. "You cannot pass. There is a riot down there about a plague-stricken house which has been broken open, and the pestilence is being scattered to the four winds. You cannot go this way." The bearers halted. "What way, then?" the foremost inquired. "Whither would you go?" the man asked him. "To Salisbury Court." "Why, that is my way." "You must go round by the Fleet Ditch." "As I must." "Come, follow me." And he went ahead briskly down Fleet Street. The chair resumed its way in the altered direction. Miss Farquharson had leaned forward when it halted to hear what was said. She had observed no closed house in the alley upon coming that way some hours ago in daylight. But she saw no reason to doubt the warning on that account. Infected houses were, after all, growing common enough by now in London streets. And she was relieved that the closing of the theater was to permit her own withdrawal into the country, away from that pestilential atmosphere. She sat back again with a little sigh of weariness, and in silence suffered herself to be borne along. But when they came to the Fleet Ditch, instead of turning to the right, her bearers kept straight on, following ever in the wake of that tall cloaked man who had offered to conduct them. They were halfway over the bridge before Miss Farquharson became aware of what was happening. She leaned forward and called to them that they were mistaking the way. They took no more heed of her than if they had been stone deaf, and trudged stolidly onward. She cried out to them more loudly and insistently. Still they took no notice. They were across the bridge, and swinging away now to the right toward the river. Miss Farquharson came to the conclusion that there must be some way back of which she was not aware, and that some good reason inspired their guide. So, for all that she still accounted it strange that the chairman should have been so deaf to her commands, she allowed them now to proceed without further interference. But when far from finding any way to recross the ditch, the chair suddenly turned to the left in the direction of Baynard's castle. Her bewilderment suddenly redoubled. "Stop," she called to them. "You're going the wrong way. Set down the chair at once. Set down, I say." They heeded her as little as before. Not only did they press steadily onward, but they even quickened their pace, stumbling over the rough cobbles of the street in the darkness that pervaded it. Alarm awoke in her. "Nathaniel!" she called shrilly, leaning forward, and vainly seeking to grasp the shoulder just beyond her reach. "Nathaniel!" Her alarm increased. Was this really Nathaniel, or was it someone else? There was something sinisterly purposeful in the stolid manner in which the fellow plodded on unheeding. The tall man ahead who led them, little more than a dark outline now, had slackened his step so that the chair was rapidly overtaking him. She attempted to rise, to force up the roof of the chair, to thrust open the apron in front of her, but neither yielded to her exertions. And in the end she realized that both had been fastened. That made an end of any doubt with which she may still have been deluding herself. She yielded to terror, and her screams for help awoke the silent echoes of the street. The tall man halted, turned, rapped out an oath, and authoritatively commanded the men to set down. But even as he issued the order, the flare of a link suddenly made its appearance at the corner of Paul's Chains, and in the ring of yellow light it cast they could discern the black outlines of 3 or 4 moving figures. Light and figures paused a moment there, checked by the girl's cries. Then abruptly they flung forward at clattering speed. On, on. Hollis bade the chairman curtly, and himself went forward again, the chair now following with Miss Farquharson steadily shrieking for help and beating frenziedly upon roof and apron. She, too, had seen those heaven-sent rescuers rushing swiftly to meet them, and she may have caught in the torchlight the livid gleam of swords drawn for her deliverance. They were a party of 3 gentlemen lighted by a link boy on their homeward way. They were young and adventurous, as it chanced, and very ready to bear their blades in defense of a lady in distress. But it happened that this was a contingency for which Hollis was fully prepared. One, indeed, which he could not have left out of his calculations. The foremost of those hastening gallants was suddenly upon him, his point at the level of the colonel's breast, and bawling dramatically, "Stand, villain! Stand yourself, fool!" Hollis answered him in tones of impatient scorn, making no shift to draw in self-defense. "Back, all of you, on your lives! We are conveying this poor lady home. She has the plague." That checked their swift advance. It even flung them back a little, treading on one another's toes in their sudden intimidation. Brave enough against ordinary men and ordinary lethal weapons, they were stricken with instant panic before the horrible, impalpable foe whose presence was thus announced to them. Miss Farquharson, who had overheard the colonel's warning and perceived its paralyzing effect upon those rescuers whom she had been regarding as heaven-sent, leaned forward, in frenzied fear that the trap was about to close upon her. "He lies! He lies!" she shrieked in her terror. "It is false. I have not the plague. I have not the plague. I swear it. Do not heed him, sirs. Do not heed him. Deliver me from these villains. Oh, of your charity, sirs, in God's name, do not abandon me, or I am a lost woman else." They stood at gaze, moved by her piteous cries, yet hesitating what to believe. Hollis addressed them, speaking sadly. "She is distraught, poor soul, demented. I am her husband, sirs, and she fancies me an enemy. I am told it is a common enough state in those upon whom this terrible disease has fastened." It was a truth of which all London was aware by now, that the onslaught of the plague was commonly attended by derangement of the mind and odd delusions. "And for your governance, sirs, I should tell you that I greatly fear I am, myself, already infected. I beg you, then, not to detain me, but to stand aside so that we may regain our home before my strength is spent." Behind him, Miss Farquharson continued to scream her furious denials and her piteous entreaties that they should deliver her. If they still doubted, yet they dared not put their doubts to the test. Moreover, her very accents by now in their frenzy seemed to confirm this man's assertion that she was mad. A moment yet those rescuers hung there, hesitating. Then suddenly one of them surrendered to his mounting fear and horror. "Away! Away!" he cried, and, swinging round, dashed off down the street. His panic communicated itself instantly to his fellows, and they went clattering after him, the link boy bringing up the rear, his streaming torch held high. Aghast, spent by her effort, Miss Farquharson sank back with a moan, feeling herself exhausted and abandoned. But when one of the chairmen, in obedience to an order from the colonel, pulled the apron open, she at once leapt up and out, and would go on speeding thence, but that the other bearer caught her about her slender body, and held her firmly, whilst his fellow wound now about her head a long scarf which Hollis had tossed him for the purpose. That done, they made fast her hand behind her with a handkerchief, thrust her back into the chair, and shut her in. She sat now helpless, half choked by the scarf, which not only served to muffle her cries, but also blindfolded her, so that she no longer knew whither she was being conveyed. All that she knew was that the chair was moving. On it went, then away to the left and up the steep gradient of Paul's Chains, and lastly to the right into Knight Rider Street. Before a substantial house on the north side of this, between Paul's Chains and Sermon Lane, the chair came to a final standstill and was set down. The roof was raised and the apron pulled open, and hands seized upon her to draw her forth. She hung back, a dead weight, in a last futile attempt at resistance. Then she felt herself bodily lifted in strong arms and swung to a man's shoulder. Thus Hollis bore her into the house, where in the chair, the poles having been removed, was also presently bestowed. The colonel turned to the right of the roomy hall, in which 2 silent figures stood at attention, Buckingham's other 2 French lackeys, and entered a moderate-sized square chamber, somberly furnished and somberly wainscoted from bare floor to whitened ceiling. In the middle of the room, a table with massive corkscrew legs was laid for supper, and on its polished surface gleamed crystal and silver in the light from the great candle branch that occupied its middle. The long window overlooking the street was closed-shuttered, the shutters barred. Under this stood a daybed of cane and carved oak, furnished with velvet cushions of a dull wine color. To this daybed Hollis conveyed his burden. Having set her down, he stooped to remove the handkerchief that bound her wrists. It was a compassionate act, for he knew that the pinioning must be causing pain by now to her arms. Under the broad brim of his hat, his face, moist from his exertions, gleamed white. His lips were tightly compressed. Hitherto intent upon the accomplishment of the business as he had planned it, he had given little thought to its ugly nature. Now suddenly as he bent over this figure, at once so graceful, so delicate and frail, as a faint sweet perfume that she used assailed his nostrils, conveying to his senses a suggestion of her daintiness and femininity. Disgust of the thing he did overwhelmed him, like physical nausea. He turned away to close the door, tossing aside his hat and cloak, and mopping his brow as he went, for the sweat was running down him like basting on a capon. Whilst he was crossing the room, she struggled to her feet, and her hands being now at liberty, she tugged and tore at the scarf until she loosed it, so that it slipped down from her face and hung in folds about her neck and shoulders above the line of her low-cut, modish bodice. Erect there, breathing hard, her eyes flaming, she flung her words angrily at the tall, loose-limbed figure of her captor. "Sir," she said, "you will let me depart at once, or you shall pay dearly for this villainy." He closed the door and turned again to face her. He attempted to smother in a smile the hangdog expression of his countenance. "Unless you suffer me to depart at once, you shall." There she paused. Abruptly she broke off, to lean forward a little, staring at him, her parted lips and dilating eyes bearing witness to an amazement so overwhelming that it overrode both her anger and her fear. Hoarse and tense came her voice at last. "Who are you? What is your name?" He stared in his turn, checking in the very act of mopping his brow, wondering what she saw in him to be moving her so oddly. Where she stood, her face was more than half in shadow, whilst the light of that cluster of candles on the table was beating fully upon his own. He was still considering how he should answer her, what name assume, when she startled him by sparing his invention further trouble in the matter. "You are Randall Hollis," she cried on a wild, strained note. He advanced a step in a sort of consternation, breathless, some sudden ghastly emotion tearing his heart, eyeing her wildly, his jaw fallen, his whole face livid as a dead man's. "Randall Hollis," she repeated in that curiously tortured voice. You of all men, and to do this thing," where there had been only wild amazement in her eyes. He beheld now a growing horror, until mercifully she covered her face with her hands. For a moment he copied her action. He, too, acting spasmodically, covered his face. The years rolled back. The room with its table laid for that infamous supper melted away to be replaced in his vision by a cherry orchard in bloom, and in that orchard a girl on a swing, teasing yet adorable, singing a song that brought him, young and clean and honorable, hastening to her side. He saw himself a lad of 20 going out into the world with a lady's glove in his hat, a glove that to this day he cherished, bent upon knight-errantry for that sweet lady's sake, to conquer the world no less that he might cast it in her lap. And he saw her, this Sylvia Farquharson of the Duke's Theater, as she had been in those long dead days when her name was Nancy Sylvester. The years had wrought in her appearance a change that utterly disguised her, where in this resplendently beautiful woman could he discover the little child he had loved so desperately. How could he have dreamt his little Nancy Sylvester transformed into magnificent Sylvia Farquharson, whose name he had heard used as a byword for gallantry, lavishness, and prodigality, whose fame was as widespread and questionably lustrous as that of Moll Davies or Eleanor Gwynn? He reeled back until his shoulders came to rest against the closed door, and stared in dazed amazement, his soul revolted by the horror of the situation in which they found themselves. "God!" he groaned aloud. "My Nan, my little Nan." Chapter 18, the parley. At any other time and in any other place this meeting must have filled him with horror of a different kind. His soul might have been swept by pain and anger to find Nancy Sylvester, whom his imagination had placed high and inaccessible as the very stars, whose memory had acted as a beacon to him, casting a pure white light to guide him to a quagmire of many a vile temptation, reduced to the state of, as he judged it, evil splendor. Just now, however, The consciousness of his own infamous position blotted out all other thought. He staggered forward and fell on his knees before her. "Nan! Nan!" he cried in a strangled voice. "I did not know. I did not dream." It was enough to confirm the very worst of the fears that were assailing her, to afford her that explanation of his presence against which she had been desperately struggling in defiance of the overwhelming evidences. She stood before him, a woman of little more than average height and of an almost sapling grace, yet invested with something proud and regal and aloof that did not desert her even now in this terrible situation, at once of peril and of cruelest disillusion. She was dressed as it chanced, entirely in white, and all white she stood before him save where the folds of the blue scarf of which she had been muffled still hung about her neck and bosom. No whiter than her oval face was her gown of shimmering ivory satin. About her long-shaped eyes, that could by turns be provocative, mocking, and caressing in their glances, dark stains of suffering were growing manifest, whilst in their blue-green depths there was nothing but stark horror. She put a delicate, tapering hand to her brow, brushing thence the modish tendrils of her chestnut hair, and twice she attempted to speak before words would come from her stiff lips. "You did not know." Pain rendered harsh and rasping the voice whose natural music had seduced whole multitudes, and the sound of it was a sword of sharpness to that kneeling, distracted man. "It is, then, as I thought. You have done this thing at the hiring of another. You are so fallen that you play the hired bully, and you are Randall Hollis." A groan, a wild gesture of despair, were the outward signs of his torment. On his knees, he dragged himself nearer to her very feet. Nan, don't judge until you have heard, until—" But she interrupted him. His very abjectness was in itself an eloquent admission of the worst. "Heard? Have you not told me all? You did not know. You did not know that it was I whom you were carrying off. Do you think I cannot guess who is the master villain that employs you for his jackal? And you did not know it was I, that it was one who loved you once, when you were clean and honest. Nan, oh God! But I never loved you as I loathe you now for the foul thing you are become, you that were to conquer the world for me. You did not know that it was I whom you were paid to carry off, and you are so shameless, so lost to honor, that you dared urge at ignorance as your excuse. Well, you know it now, and I hope you are punished in the knowledge. I hope that, if any lingering sense of shame abides in you, it will scorch your miserable soul to ashes. Get up, man, she bade him, regally contemptuous, splendidly tragic. Shall groveling there mend any of your vileness? He came instantly to his feet, yet it was not, as she supposed, in obedience to her command, so much as out of sudden awakening to the need for instant action. All the agony that was threatening to burst his soul must be repressed. All that he had to say in expression, and perhaps relieving of that agony, must wait. "What I have done I can undo," he said, and, commanding himself under stress of that urgent necessity, he assumed a sudden firmness. "Shall we stand talking here, instead of acting, when every moment of delay increases your danger? Come, as I carried you hither, in defiance of all, so will I carry you hence again at once, while yet there is time." She recoiled before the hand that he flung out as if to seize her and compel her. There was a sudden fury of anger in her eyes, a fury of scorn on her lips. "You will carry me hence. You! I am to trust myself to you." He never winced under the lash of her contempt. So intent was he upon that one urgent thing. "Will you stay, then, and trust yourself to Buckingham?" he flung fiercely back at her. "Come, I say," he commanded, oddly masterful in his overwhelming concern for her. "With you? Oh, not that. Never with you. Never." He beat his hands together in his frenzy of impatience. "Will you not realize that there is no time to lose? That if you stay here you are lost? Go alone if you will. Return home at once. But since you must go afoot, and you may presently be pursued, suffer me at least to follow after you, to do what I can to make you safe. Trust me in this. For your own sake, trust me. In God's name." "Trust you?" she echoed, and almost she seemed to laugh. "You? After this?" After this. Because of this. I may be as vile as you are deeming me. Not a doubt I am. But I never could have been vile to you. It may not excuse me, protest that I did not know it was against you that I was acting. but it should make you believe that I am ready to defend you now that I know. You must believe me. Can you doubt me in such a matter? Unless I meant honestly by you, why should I be urging you to depart? Come." This time he caught her by the wrist and maintained his hold against her faint attempt to liberate herself. He attempted to draw her after him across the room. A moment she hung back, resisting still. "For God's sake," he implored her madly. "At any moment Buckingham may arrive." This time she yielded to a spur that earlier her passion had made her disregard. Between such evils there could be no choice. She looked into his livid, gleaming face, distorted by his anguish and anxiety. I can trust you in this? If I trust you, you will bear me safely home? You swear it." "As God's my witness," he sobbed in his impatience. There was an end to her resistance now. More, she displayed a sudden urgency that matched his own. Quick, then," she panted. "Ah." He drew a deep breath of thankfulness, snatched up hat and cloak from the chair where he tossed them, and drew her across the room by the wrist, of which he still retained his grip. And then, just as they reached the door, it was thrust open from without, and the tall, graceful figure of the Duke of Buckingham, his curled fair head almost touching the lintel, stood before them, a flush of fevered expectancy on his handsome face. In his right hand he held his heavily feathered hat. His left rested on the pommel of the light dress rapier he was wearing. The pair recoiled before him, and Hollis loosed her wrist upon the swift, instinctive apprehension that here he was like to need his hands for other things. His grace was all in glittering satin, black and white, like a magpie, with jewels in the lace of his throat and a baldric of garter blue across his breast. A moment he stood there agaze, with narrowing eyes, puzzled by something odd in her attitudes, and looking from Miss Farquharson's pale, startled loveliness to the stiff, grim figure of her companion. Then he came slowly forward, leaving the door wide behind him. He bowed low to the lady without speaking. As he came erect again, it was to the colonel that he addressed himself. "All should be here, I think," he said, waving a hand towards table and sideboard. Hollis half turned to follow the gesture, and he stood a moment as if pondering the supper equipment, glad of that moment in which to weigh the situation. Out there in the hall, somewhere just beyond that open door, would be waiting, he knew, Buckinghams for French lackeys, who at their master's bidding would think no more of slitting his throat than of slicing the glazed capon on the sideboard yonder. He had been in many a tighter corner than this in his adventurous life, but never before had there been a woman on his hands to hamper him, and at the same time to agonize and numb his wits with anxiety. He thanked heaven for the prudence which had silenced his impulse to bid Buckingham stand aside when he had first made his appearance. Had he acted upon that, there would very likely have been an end to him by now, and once there was an end of him, Nan would lie entirely at the Duke's mercy. His life had come suddenly to matter very much. He must go very warily. The Duke's voice, sharp with impatience, roused him. "Well, booby, will you stand there all night considering?" Hollis turned. "All is here, under your Grace's hand, I think," he said quietly. "Then you may take yourself off." Hollis bowed submissively. He dared not look at Nan, but he caught the sudden gasp of her breath, and without looking beheld her start, and imagined the renewed horror and wide-eyed scorn in which he regarded this fresh display of cowardice and vileness. He stalked to the door, the Duke's eyes following him with odd suspicion, puzzled ever by that something here which he perceived, but whose significance eluded him. Holding the edge of the open door in his hand, Hollis half turned again. He was still playing for time in which to decide upon his course of action. "Your Grace, I take it, will not require me further tonight?" His Grace considered. Beyond the Duke, Hollis had a glimpse of Nan, standing wide-eyed, livid as death, leaning against the table, her right hand pressed upon her heaving breast as if to control its tumult. "No," said his Grace slowly at last, "yet you had best remain at hand with Francois and the others." "Very well," said Hollis, and turned to go. The key was, he observed, on the outside of the door. He stooped and withdrew it from the lock. "Your Grace would perhaps prefer the key on the inside," he said, with an odious smirk, and, whilst his Grace impatiently shrugged his indifference, Hollis made the transference. Having made it, he closed the door swiftly, and he had quietly turned the key in the lock, withdrawn and pocketed it before his grace recovered from his surprise at the eccentricity of his behavior. "What's this?" he demanded sharply, taking a step toward the colonel. And from Nan there came a faint cry, a sob scarcely more than to announce a reaction caused by sudden understanding and a revival of her hopes from the despair into which she had fallen. Hollis, his shoulders to the door, showed a face that was now grim and set. He cast from him again the hat and cloak which he had been holding. "It is, your grace, that I desire a word in private with you, safe from the inconvenient intrusion of your lackeys." The Duke drew himself up, very stiff and stern, not a little intrigued, as you can see by all this, but quite master of himself. Fear, as I think I have said, was an emotion utterly unknown to him. Had he but been capable of the same self-mastery, in other directions he might have been the greatest man in England. He made now no outcry, put no idle questions that must derogate from the dignity with which he felt incumbent to invest himself. "Proceed, sir," he said coldly. "Let us have the explanation of this insolence, that so we may make an end of it. That is soon afforded." Hollis, too, spoke quietly. "This lady, your grace, is a friend of mine, an old friend. I did not know it until I had conveyed her hither. Upon discovering it, I would have escorted her hence again, and I was about to do so when your grace arrived. I have now to ask you to pledge me your word of honor that you will do nothing to prevent our peaceful departure, that you will offer no hindrance either in your own person or in that of your servants." For a long moment, Buckingham stood considering him without moving from the spot where he stood, midway between Hollis and the girl, his shoulder to the latter. Beyond a heightening of the color about his eyes and cheekbones, he gave no sign of emotion. He even smiled, though not quite pleasantly. "But how simple," he said with a little laugh. "Nothing, indeed, could be of a more engaging simplicity. And how touching is the situation, how romantic. An old friend of yours, you say, and of course, because of that, the world is to stand still." Then his voice hardened. "And should I refuse to pledge my word, what does Colonel Hollis propose?" "It will be very bad for your grace," said Hollis. "Almost, I think, you threaten me." Buckingham betrayed a faint amazement. You may call it that. The Duke's whole manner changed. He plucked off his mask of arrogant languor. "By God!" he ejaculated, and his voice was rasping as a file. "That is enough of this insolence, my man. You'll unlock that door at once, and go your ways, or I'll call my men to beat you to a jelly. It was lest your grace should be tempted to such ungentle measures that I took the precaution to lock the door." Hollis was smooth as velvet. "I will ask your grace to observe that it is a very stout door, and that the lock is a very sound one. You may summon your lackeys, but before they can reach you, it is very probable that your grace will be in hell." Buckingham laughed, and even as he laughed, he whipped a light rapier from its scabbard and flung forward in a lunge across the distance which he had measured with his very practiced swordsman's eye. It was an action swift as lightning and of a deadly precision, surely calculated to take the other by surprise and transfix him before he could make a move to guard himself. But swift as it was, in practice as was the Duke's skill, he was opposed to one as swift in practice, one who had too often kept his life with his hands not to be schooled in every trick of rough and tumble. Hollis had seen that calculating look in the Duke's eyes as they measured the distance between them, and because he had more than once before seen just such a calculating look in the eyes of other men, and knew what followed, he had guessed the Duke's purpose, and he had been prepared. Even as the Duke drew and lunged in one movement, so, in one movement, too, Hollis drew and fell on guard to deflect that treacherous lightning stroke. Nan's sudden scream of fear, and the clash of the two blades rang out at the same moment. The colonel's parry followed on into the enveloping movement of a riposte that whirled his point straight at the Duke's face on the low level to which this had been brought by the lunge. To avoid it, Buckingham was forced to make a recovery, a retreat as precipitate as the advance had been swift. Erect once more, his grace fell back. His breathing quickened a little, and for a moment the two men stood in silence, their points lowered, measuring each other with their eyes. Then Hollis spoke. "Your grace, this is a game in which the dice are heavily cogged against you," he said gravely. "Better take the course I first proposed." Buckingham uttered a sneering laugh. He had entirely mistaken the other's meaning. "Why, you roaring captain, You pitiful Bobadil, do you think to affright me with swords and antics? It is against yourself the dice are loaded. Unlock that door, and get you hence, or I'll carve you into ribbons. Oh, and who's the roaring captain now? Who the Bobadil? Who the very butcher of silk button? Cried Hollis, stung to anger. He would have added more, perhaps, but the Duke stemmed him. Enough talk, he snapped. The key, you rogue, or I'll skewer you where you stand. Hollis grinned at him. I little thought when I saved your life that night at Worcester that I should be faced with the need to take it thus. You think to move me with that reminder, do you? Said the Duke, and drove at him. Hardly. I'll move you in another way, you lovelorn ninnyhammer. Hollis snarled back, and then the blades ground together again, and they were engaged in deadly earnest. Chapter 19, The Battle. I do not suppose that any two men ever engaged with greater confidence than those. Doubt of the issue was in the mind of neither. Each regarded the other half contemptuously, as a fool rushing upon his doom. Hollis was a man of his hands, trained in the hardest school of all, and although for some months now sword practice had been a thing neglected by him, yet it never occurred to him that he should find serious opposition in a creature whose proper environment was a court rather than the camp. The Duke of Buckingham, whilst making no parade of the fact, was possibly the best blade of his day in England. He, too, after all, had known his years of adversity and adventurous vagrancy, years in which he devoted a deal of study to the sword, for which he was gifted with a natural aptitude, of great coolness in danger, vigorous and agile of frame. He had a length of reach which would still give him an advantage on those rare occasions where all else was equal. He regarded the present affair merely as a tiresome interruption to be brushed aside as speedily as possible. Therefore he attacked with vigor, and his very contempt of his opponent made him careless. It was well for him in the first few seconds of that combat that Hollis had reflected that to kill the Duke would be much too serious a matter in its ultimate consequences, and possibly in its immediate ones. For Buckingham's lackeys were at hand, and, after disposing of their master, he must still run the gauntlet of those fellows before he could win to freedom with Nancy. His aim, therefore, must be to disarm or disable the Duke, and then, holding him at his mercy, compel from him the pledge to suffer their unmolested departure, which the Duke at present refused. Thus it happened that in the first moments of the engagement he neglected the openings which the Duke's recklessness afforded him, intent instead upon reaching and crippling the Duke's sword arm. Two such attempts, however, each made over the Duke's guard on a riposte, disclosed to Buckingham not only the intention, but also something of the quality of the swordsman to whom he was opposed, whilst the ease with which the Duke foiled those attempts caused Hollis also to correct the assumption upon which he had engaged. The next few seconds fully revealed to each of them the rashness of underrating an antagonist, and as their mutual respect increased, they settled down now to fight more closely and cautiously. In the background, in a tall armchair to which she had sunk, and in which she now reclined bereft of strength, white with terror, her pulses drumming, her breathing so shortened that she felt as if she must suffocate, sat Nancy Sylvester, the only agonized witness of that encounter which she was herself a subject. At first the Duke's back was toward her, whilst beyond him, Hollis faced her, so that she had a full view of his countenance. It was very calm and set, and there was a fixed, unblinking intentness about the gray eyes that never seemed to waver in their steady regard of his opponents. She observed the elastic, half-crouching poise of his body, and in the ease with which his sword was whirled this way and that, she realized the trained skill and vigorous suppleness of his wrist. She began to take courage. She gathered as she watched him some sense of the calm confidence in which he fought, a confidence which gradually communicated itself to her, and came to soothe the terror that had been numbing her wits. Suddenly there was a change of tactics. Buckingham moved swiftly aside, away to his left. It was almost a leap, and as he moved he lunged in a new line he now confronted, a lunge calculated to take Hollis in the flank. But Hollis shifted his feet with the easy speed of a dancer and veered to face his opponent in this new line, ready to meet the hard-driven point when it was delivered. As a result of that breaking of ground, she now had them both in profile, and it was only now, when too late, that she perceived what an opportunity she had missed to strike a blow in her own defense. The thing might have been done, should have been done whilst the Duke was squarely offering her his undefended back. Had she been anything, she told herself, But the numb, dazed, witless creature that she was, she would have snatched a knife from the table to plant it between his shoulder blades. It may have been the sense of some such peril, the fighter's instinctive dread of an unguarded back, that had driven the Duke to break ground as he had done. He repeated the action again and yet again, compelling Hollis each time to circle, so that he might meet the ever-altered line of attack, until in the end the Duke had the door behind him and both Hollis and the girl in front. Meanwhile, the sounds of combat in that locked room, the stamp of shifting feet, and the ringing of blades had drawn the attention of the men in the hall outside. There came a vigorous knocking on the door, accompanied by voices. The sound was an enheartening relief to Buckingham, who was finding his opponent much more difficult to dispatch than he had expected. Not only this, but fearless though he might be, he was growing conscious that the engagement was not without danger to himself. This rascal Hollis was of an unusual strength. He raised his voice suddenly. "À moi, François Antoine. À moi. Monseigneur," wailed the voice of François, laden with alarm from beyond the oak. "Infant," says Laporte. Buckingham shouted back. Came heavy blows upon the door in answer to that command. Then silence and a shifting of feet as the grooms set their straining shoulders to the oak. But the stout timbers withstood such easy methods. The men's footsteps retreated, and there followed a spell of silence, whose meaning was quite obvious to both combatants. The grooms were gone for implements to break down the door. That made an end of the colonel's hopes of rendering the Duke defenseless, a task whose difficulty he began to perceive that he must find almost insuperable. He settled down, therefore, to fight with grimmer purpose. There was no choice for him now but to kill Buckingham before the grooms won through that door, or all would be lost. Indeed, the act would no doubt be followed by his own destruction at the hands either of Buckingham's followers or the law. But Nancy, at least, would be delivered from her persecutor. Full now of that purpose, he changed his tactics, and from a defensive which had aimed at wearing down the Duke's vigor, he suddenly passed to the offensive. Disengage now followed disengage with lightning swiftness, and for some seconds the Duke found the other's point to be everywhere at once. Hard-pressed, his grace was compelled to give ground. But as he fell back, he sidestepped upon reaching the door, not daring now to set his shoulders to it lest, by thus cutting off his own retreat, he should find himself pinned there by the irresistible blade of his opponent. It was the first wavering of his confidence, this instinctive craving for space behind him in which to retreat. So far Hollis had fought on almost academic lines, no more, indeed, being necessary for the purpose he had been setting himself. But now that this purpose was changed, and finding that mere speed and vigor could not drive his point beyond the Duke's iron guard, he had recourse to more liberal methods. There was a trick, a deadly, never-failing trick, that he had learned years ago from an Italian master, a soldier of fortune who, like himself, had drifted into mercenary service with the Dutch. He would essay it now. He sidestepped to the left and lunged on a high line of tierce, his point aimed at the throat of his opponent. The object of this was no more than to make the Duke swing round to parry. The lunge was not intended to go home. It was no more than a feint. Without meeting the opposing blade as it shifted to the threatened line, Hollis dropped his point and his body at the same time, until he was supported at fullest stretch by his left hand upon the ground. Upward under the Duke's guard he whirled his point, and the Duke, who had been carried, as Hollis had calculated that he would be, a little too far round in the speed required, thus unduly exposing his left flank, found that point coming straight for his heart. He was no more than in time to beat aside with his left hand, and even so it ripped through the sleeve of his doublet and tore his flesh just above the elbow. But for that wound there might well have been an end to Hollis. For this trick of his was such that it must succeed, or else leave him, that essays it momentarily at the mercy of his antagonist. That moment presented itself now, but it was gone again before the Duke had mastered the twitch occasioned him by the tearing of his arm. His recovery and downward-driven repulse were swift, but too late by half a heartbeat. Hollis was no longer there to be impaled. They smiled grimly at each other as erect they stood, pausing a second after that mutually near escape of death. Then, as a succession of resounding blows fell upon the door, Hollis drove at him again with redoubled fury. From the sound of the blows, it would seem that the grooms had got an axe to work, and were bent upon hacking out the lock. Hollis realized that there was no time to lose. Buckingham, that his safety lay in playing for time and allowing the other's furious attacks to spend themselves against his defense. Twice again, despite his wound, he used his left hand, from which the blood was dripping freely, to dash aside the other's blade. Once he did it with impunity. But when he repeated the action, Hollis took advantage of it to fling himself suddenly forward inside the Duke's guard, until they were breast to breast, and with his own left he seized the Duke's sword wrist in a grip that paralyzed it. Before, however, he could carry out his intention of shortening his sword, his own wrist was captive in the Duke's blood-smeared left hand. He sought to force himself free of that grip, but the Duke maintained it with the tenacity born of the desperate knowledge that his life depended on it, that if he loosed his hold, there would be an instant end of him. Thus now in this fierce corps they writhed and swayed hither and thither, snarling and panting and tugging, whilst the sound of blows upon the door announced the splintering of a panel, and Nancy, half swooning in her chair, followed the nightmare struggles of the two men in wide-eyed but only half-seeing terror. They crashed across the room to the daybed under the window, and the Duke went down upon it backwards in a sitting posture, but still he retained his grip of the colonel's sword wrist. Hollis thrust his knee into the Duke's stomach to gain greater leverage. Now at last, with the increased strain that Hollis brought to bear, Buckingham's fingers were beginning to slip, and then under a final blow the door all splintered about. The lock flew open, and the grooms flowed into the room to their master's rescue. Hollis tore his wrist free at the same moment by a last wrench, but it was too late, casting the Duke's sword hand from him. He sprang away and round with a tearing sob to face the lackeys. For a second his glittering point held them at bay. Then the blow of a club shivered the blade, and they rushed in upon him. He felled one of them with a blow of the hilt, which he still retained, before a club took him across the skull. Under that blow he reeled back against the table, his limbs sagged, and he sank down in a heap, unconscious. As he lay there, one of the grooms, standing over him, swung his club again with the clear intention of beating out his brains. But the Duke arrested the descending blow. "It is not necessary," he said. He was white and breathing hard from his exertions, and there was a fevered glitter in his eyes. But these signs apart, he was master of himself. "Your arm, monseigneur," cried Francois, pointing to blood that filled his sleeve. "Bah, a scratch." Presently, then he pointed to the prone limp figure of Hollis, from whose head the blood was slowly trickling. "Get a rope, Francois, and truss him up." Francois departed on his errand. "You others carry Antoine out, then return for Bobadil. I may have a use for him yet." They moved to obey him, and picked up their fellow whom Hollis had felled before he himself went down. The Duke was not pleased with them at all. A little more, and they might have been too late. But to reproach them with it entailed an admission which this proud, vain man was reluctant to make. They trooped out obediently, and Buckingham, still very pale, but breathing now more composedly, turned to Nancy with a queer little smile on lips that looked less red than usual.